a brilliant scholar on many of these matters, and it's really a privilege that you're here. So
Thanks.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, for this distinguished group. And I learned about your biography that people extract from the internet. So when you adjust your biography, you better erase what you have before, because it's dangerous. In any case, I'm delighted to be here for the second year in a row. Charles invited me here and to speak to you about the broad subject which I coined as the Israelization of Antisemitism. But it relates to a much broader discussion, which is the move of the gravity of the Jewish people from a people of exile and diaspora to a people of sovereignty. These are my 2 volumes that I'm now completing. It's a long journey which I took, trying to explain what happened to the Jewish people when sovereignty is informing their life more than anything else. And that relates also, of course, to the subject of anti-Semitism, because when the gravity of the Jewish world, as I will explain shortly, will move from the life without power and without I would say control over their lives, to a very powerful nation state, ranked among the top strongest nation in the world by all accounts, whatever it means. It changes entirely the ethos of the people. It impacts on almost every aspect of Jewish life, and that also has repercussions for the entire discussion of the subject of anti-Semitism, which has been, of course, this is too cold on me if you don't mind, which has been, of course, related mostly to people who are powerless, to people who lack sovereignty, where the question of the Jewish people is asked in places where they are minority, be it religious minority, national minority, ethnic minority, etc., to people who dominate and have a majority, a strong majority, and of course, a sovereign body. This sovereign body, I don't have to explain to you, is now 70 years old. Its evolution is such that in any trajectory whatsoever, by all accounts and by all demographers, the state of Israel will encompass the majority of the Jewish people very soon. This, in and of itself, is a mega shift in Jewish history, perhaps from the first temple to now, as much as we know about this. We have a moment in history when the people who were informed by the lack of sovereignty, by exile, by diaspora, are now informed by the power in the state. To make matters clear, we are now at the stage where about, and again, depends how you count, 45 to 46% already, last year they said it's 44, it doesn't matter, of the Jewish people already reside in Israel. By all accounts, in 10 years, maybe less, because as you very well know, Israel is the fastest growing population in the world among the developing nations. We have on average 3.19 babies for a woman, per woman, which is a huge development. And as a result of that, our population grows very fast, and it's not only ultra-Orthodox women, because people think it's not because of the ultra-Orthodox community, which of course grows the fastest in Israel, which is now 6.5 children per woman. We have what we call religious Zionists, who have, by all statistical account that we have them, about 4.6. We have communal cities. Those of you who reside in Israel will know Modi'in, Shoam, all of these communal cities where they have 3.8 babies, etc., etc. So this is a country that really, the family is still a very important structure in the life of Israel. And the evolution of the country is such that we grow so much that in his last book, Alon Tal, who was published by Oxford University Press, make the point that we are much too crowded and we really have to adopt a policy of limiting population. The legacy of Israel was always about increasing population, be it Jewish population, but the reality is that by all projections, the government projection, all the projections, in 20 years, the population of Israel will be around by, and these are, demographers, but by all projections, around 15 million people. We are no longer also a small country. In addition, of course, to that, the longevity in Israel is quite impressive, as you very well know. The average age for women in Israel is now over 84 years old, which is women live to 84 years. And this is among the top 5 ranked also in the world, and also for men around 82. So what you see is basically a population that grows very rapidly, and that is also on the top of which we see that migration from Israel has decreased, repeatedly decreased in the last 12 years. People think because of the Second Intifada, and also because of the evolution in other parts of the world, including in Europe and the United States, because of the economic crisis and so on. So we also don't have migration, massive migration. Rather, we had positive migration, especially because of aliyah, because of migrants who are coming from other countries. The latest wave anticipated, it's not a joke, I guess, as you read this week's papers. Ellen Arkus spoke to you, perhaps from Britain. Who would have known? The last one was from France. When I did my work on the Israelization of French Jewry, beginning in 2010 up to 2014, and I wrote about the Israelization of French Jewry, the migration started, of course, after the Halimi affair, but when the bombings took place before the, before the Kosher Mart, even in Toulouse, etc., we had suddenly thousands of French people moving to Israel, even though the numbers were not staggering, but we have also many people coming from Ukraine during the war in Ukraine. So there is positive migration, Jewish migration, and less Israelis are migrating, because also the economic situation has been improved for most Israelis. We are talking about the GDP per capita now. It's around 40,000, which is quite remarkable in terms of the OECD. So we supposedly very happy people. I said supposedly because many people are upset, but that has been part of the Jewish history altogether. You're supposed to be both happy and upset almost at the same time. And when you look at Israelis ranking and what they call the index of happiness, you'll find that Israelis are always ranked among the 10 happiest people. And this is before Ritalin. With Ritalin, they're much happier, and they get Ritalin and Prozac, and they are absolutely settled. The Israelis are quite happy, prosperous, and also growing in numbers. Now, this is not a joke, it's a story, notwithstanding all the issues that we have. The issues vis-a-vis the Palestinians, the bickering over religion and state, the question of periphery versus center, the division between the rich and the poor, because Israel is, of course, also, as you know, you read about the startup nation, you're all familiar with this, so we also grow in terms of divisions in our society. But nevertheless, this is the reality where all other realities of Jewish life abroad pales in comparison. In addition, of course, to other issues pertaining to shifts in world affairs that kind of harm the realities of Jewish life. As I suggested in Ukraine, sometime in France, and in Europe, right now in Europe we have most numbers are talking perhaps about 1 million Jews in Europe left. I don't know the numbers, but more or less. We did large work for this project in England for 2 years, in France on the Israelization, things were published, so those of you are interested. But we know that even what I make the point, that in France and in Britain, the two centers of European Jewry we see this phenomena of what I call the Israelization of Judaism. It's not only that Israel is the epicenter of Jewish life, but it reverberates into many other countries. The dominating power of Israel, for good or ill, we don't discuss it yet, shows that there is kind of like the centrality of Israel is becoming more and more the dominating factor in defining communities outside of Israel. This has been the case for quite some time, but it's becoming in some cases overwhelming. Especially in the case of Europe. In the United States, of course, there's a huge debate about Israel between the progressive forces, between conservative, between religious Jews and non-religious Jews. It's more complex. But by and large, this is the case. And this is a second phenomena. There is on the one hand the growth of Israel as the sovereign state, the growth of Israeli power, which puts lots of the issues of Jewish life, which we will discuss in the next few hours, in questions about what is Judaism itself, how do you define Jewish morality, how do you define us versus them, how do you get into the question of using the past, etc., etc., etc. And these are issues that pertains to the question of anti-Semitism. Because as I suggested early on in my earlier comment, anti-Semitism was basically, as Herzl put it in his Jewish State famous essay, sort of like the issue which the State of Israel will solve. The State of Israel perhaps did not solve anti-Semitism, but certainly created it in a completely different fashion. Created it not in and of itself, but has a twist into the story of anti-Semitism because of the overwhelming domination of the State of Israel on the Jewish people. If I cough, it's because my lungs are not in great shape now, so excuse me. And please feel free to intervene, because this is a long session, and I'll be delighted to take interruptions if they come. The condition which I just charted is important for understanding the subject matter that we are here to study, which is the subject of anti-Semitism. And I will say one word, notwithstanding the definitions, and notwithstanding what Corbyn is doing with the definition in Britain, there is a sense of the definition of anti-Semitism, our informant will tell us about it, there is something as a force which one cannot reckon with, because one cannot have any control over, and one cannot have a coherent and rational explanation to. This has been sort of like the most critical issue about anti-Semitism. We will go as a tour de force about how it evolved. But this is a very important factor to be reckoned with. It's something which is uncontrollable. And as a result of that, the very essence of anti-Semitism and Jewish life in the diaspora has been what I call, in my book, the life in a chaotic fashion. Arbitrariness. Arbitrariness is what informed Jewish life throughout history. That is, that you could be thinking that you are prospering, you could be thinking that you are thriving, you could be thinking that you are at the helm, you could be thinking that you are now part and parcel of the society, and overnight it can turn on you. Partly because of this unexplainable variable which always injected into the system, which is the hate of the Jews or anti-Semitism. That is, the hate of the Jews, which overnight changes their reality without their being active in this process. You may give theological explanation to the process, which is a Jewish solution to lots of things. God intervened, and so on and so forth, and eventually, we will celebrate. The Jews have invented this ingenious idea that everything happened in history is because the work of God. And we will talk about how they did it. And this is a very important evolutionary notion. Once God controls history, He, or the Almighty, will also control the redemptive moment. So anti-Semitism is built also into the theological conceptual understanding of the Jews of the question of arbitrariness or the unpredictable nature of their life. In that respect, my big claim is that Israel broke this circle. There is no longer unpredictable way of life because of the Jewish nation. Be it because the language is still there, as I show in my book. But because Israel is so mighty, notwithstanding the battles that we fight constantly, and because of the dangers, we still use the language of arbitrariness and insecurity. But because of that, there is an understanding in global affairs also that the Israeli existence is no longer a matter of arbitrariness. Even some may claim that Israel does not have the right to exist, illegitimacy and so on, all the threats that come with what we call the modern anti-Semitism or the Israelization of antisemitism. But nevertheless, the lack of arbitrariness in the system, but rather stability, I would argue. Stability is what informs more than anything else the age of the Jewish state. It is stability that comes with lots of wounds, with wars, etc. But there is a progressive stability. This doesn't mean that someone cannot undermine this creation of the sovereign state. Doesn't mean that wars cannot bring prophecies of doom. Does it mean that the Gewalt syndrome that Jews have always adopted, this is kind of like arbitrariness, don't ever think that we are thriving because the next day we will be doomed, the doomsday scenario. Notwithstanding this language, what is the most impressive notion of the Jewish people, in my opinion, is stability. And that is, when I write this 2-volume for the last 6 years, it dawned on me that this is the key factor in Jewish life today. This breaks the paradigm of Jewish history completely. And that also changes the paradigm of understanding the question of anti-Semitism. If you run into history, and it's always important because Jews without history is not a good story, we also try and explain what happened now based on our history. We have a long history of a story, a fascinating story, a story that certainly informs world civilization, certainly informs Western civilization in almost every aspect. If we run into history, we will see that this notion of the age of stability existed in the past, but it was always short-lived. Now, what I say here, of course, one has to qualify. We know very well, and this is immediately has to be said, that arbitrariness still exists for the people who are in the diaspora, especially in terms of their feelings and also in terms of their security. The French Jewry felt it, and they felt compelled to move. British Jewry, as we see only this week, the 3 main papers of British Jewry coming with this absolutely alarmist statement, which I have not seen throughout my life, about British Jewry is approaching the point perhaps of no return if Corbyn coming to power. That's the statement which was made. American Jewry, who always prided themselves on being in the most stable reality, and they themselves defined the Golden Medina, the Golden State, America, as the homeland which security will be enshrined, and that's why it was always the counter to the Zionist move. America was always much more appreciated initially as the Zionist solution. This was in fact the solution to the Jewish people, the ultimate solution. We got into the Golden Medina. We got security, we got rights. Why do we need sovereignty? When Brandeis awarded his support to the Zionist movement and became the leader of the American Zionists in 1915, his idea, being a good Jew as being a good Zionist, and being a good Zionist as being a good American, was that the Zionist is for those who cannot become Americans. Zionism, even in the minds of Echad Ha'am and others, was not supposed to bring an end to the Jewish dilemma of security. It may have been, but in the minds of the Americans, certainly America was a secure place. And even in America, we see, especially in the last 2 years, regardless of how much it is, how much we stress it, and so on, we saw, I wouldn't say a panic mode, but certainly an alarmist mode of anti-Semitism. Certainly an alarmist mode which reverberated all over the world. And that is something which is quite interesting. All of these fears do not exist in the minds and hearts of the Israelis, who also treat anti-Semitism in a completely different fashion. That has to be understood. In their minds, these are diasporic fears. These are exilic fears. These are not the fears of a sovereign people who took what they call destiny in their own hands. And that is the equation, which means that the Israelization of Judaism is not that we put an end to attacks on Jews wherever they may be it in Argentina, in Amia, and the attacks on Argentina, be it in France, be it in Britain, be it wherever it is. But nevertheless, there is a sense of a home which will provide more security than you have now. So it's a choice. It's a matter of choice and not a matter of arbitrariness. That is, if you want to be secure, come here. That's what Zionists always told you. Even though Diana Pinto and her husband came with the theory that in fact Israel poses a greater threat to the Jews more than the diaspora, because only in Israel the Iranians can drop an atomic bomb. They're not intending to drop an atomic bomb in New York. Who knows nowadays? No one knows who is intending to do what. But Trump will meet them anyhow. But I'm joking, of course. But doomsday scenario notwithstanding, we understand that this is like an extreme case scenario. An extreme case scenario. Again, this should not underestimate the language, the fears, the memories, above all the Holocaust, of course, of this fear. Especially if you look at the Yom Kippur War, 1973, when people were fearing after the unexpected invasion of the Egyptian army and the Syrians, people were talking about the destruction of the Third Temple. People were talking about the lust to turn the light off in Ben Gurion before the Six-Day War, when Gamal Abdel Nasser moved the forces to the Sinai Desert, if you remember. There was a fear of annihilation. People still talking in the Second Intifada, and the Newsweek magazine will come with the headline, "Will Israel survive?" Regardless of all of these doomsday scenarios, which come also from the historical perspective, and fears should be justified. And that is the reaction of the mighty security creed of the State of Israel. The point I'm making is that this arbitrariness is not in existence, regardless of the anti-Semitic cases which are around the globe. The point to be made also, the Israelization of Judaism, which is not related to the question of anti-Semitism, has tremendous repercussion on the production of Jewish culture. In my book, I show that basically there is very little Jewish production outside of Israel compared to Israel. And that's a very important, controversial point, nevertheless. Literature is Israeli literature. American Jewish literature, not literature by Jews, is related to Israel. French literature, if it's any French Jewish literature, related to Israel. Jewish music, Jewish art, all of the above emanates from Jerusalem, and above all now, Jewish theology, which used to be more in the United States, especially with the ultra-Orthodox, etc. The hub is becoming Jerusalem. If you look at England, we're in England. When I speak to Mervis, the chief rabbi of England, just for your information, They have, like, say, 100 and some rabbis in this country, all of whom, without any exceptions, have been trained in Jerusalem. Take 20 years back, none of whom was trained in Jerusalem. A huge shift. If you go to pray in La Victoire, in Paris, when I go on the high holidays, and the rabbi in La Victoire is sent from Israel. Of course, in Argentina, anywhere, it is something because of this exchange and the productivity of Jewish identity. And again, I don't say anything about this Jewish identity. It is complex. If we have time, we will talk about it in its complexity, because its complexity is mostly will define also the nature of Judaism into the future. Not the American Jewish complexity, Reform, conservative, ultra-Orthodox. No. It is the complexity of Jewish life in Israel which will determine the complexity of Jewish life in the future, at least as we see it. One should be always careful when one makes predictions. And of course, I'm standing cautious here, but nevertheless, the trajectories are very clear. That's why also the Reform and the conservative movements, and especially also the ultra-Orthodox, which we're not, are trying to build hubs in Israel, not only to have a standing inside Israel, but in order to legitimize themselves in the United States. I've shown it over the last 20 years in my books and my essays to show how this process has been unfolding. Notwithstanding other developments, which is of course the greatest Jewish program in the entire Jewish world today, is Birthright Israel, what we call Taglit, bringing young Jews from abroad to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, for a 2-week kind of like intense trip, what I call the silver bullet for Jewish identity. Come, see, you move from Holocaust Memorial, this memorial, okay, you come back, you are much more Jewish than you've ever been before. Yeah. It is kind of like intense Judaism 101 in 2 weeks. Now, you may laugh, but this has been adopted by many, many countries. I've been advising many countries on the issue of diasporas because of my work on diaspora and international affairs. And many countries have adopted this kind of like trips, understanding the gravity of this identity by visitation. We have here, I was told you're from India? Yes. So you know now in India, Vinay Lal, I meet with Indians, lots of them related to the diaspora, what they do, almost every aspect of it is something which is happening. All of this, as I suggest, has tremendous repercussion to our understanding and our learning of anti-Semitism, which, as I suggested, never disappeared. Because anti-Semitism has two sides to the equation. One is what you do, but the other is what others feel about you. Notwithstanding what you do, the other may feel about you. So when my friend Barnett Rubin, who is an historian of Afghanistan and Pakistan, comes back to me and said, I'm amazed when I travel in Pakistan, when I see signs, Jews out. He said, never saw a Jew in their lives. How can it be the Jews out? He said, that doesn't mean anything. There is something there that will exist, or has been in existence for quite some time. But that is a different story when I'm describing the phenomena as we should treat it in terms of the responses. When Menachem Begin talks to Anti-Defamation League leader Foxman in 1978, and he tells him, Foxman tells Begin, you must address the question of anti-Semitism with President Anwar Sadat when you are in the question of Egypt and the peace. And Begin tells him, don't worry about that. This will work itself out when we are having a sort of like a normal relation with the state of Egypt. That may not be the case. And an Egyptian people may still think, because of a variety of reasons, or someone else even, like on the issue. And I know I have some friends from Egypt here. Who are else from Egypt? It's a great honor and pleasure. But these discussions have been discussed. What are the reasons for this? And we have seen it during the event after the discussion after the Arab Spring and so on. But it's a different story. The State of Israel said, we have relations. We have bilateral relations. We have agreements. And so it's a different story. The same has been also when you get in Durban, the singling of Israel in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of the conference in Durban in 2001, and Anti-Defamation League said Israel want to send its minister of diaspora at the time, Malkior his name. The American Jewish Committee, Anti-Defamation League said to them, it's none of your business. Anti-Semitism, don't send, you will confuse them. You think it's about Israel. It's not about Israel. It's about the Jews. They're singling out you because of the Jewish hatred. So there is a lot of confusion about that, about what needs to be done, who represents, and therefore the big question of the Jewish world that still remains, who speaks on behalf of the Jews? Who listens? And with what authority they speak? It's a very important question to be asked. When you speak, who speaks on behalf of the Jews? Anti-Defamation League people say, we speak on behalf of the Jews. You, Israel, don't speak on behalf of the Jews. The State of Israel say, we always speak on behalf of the Jews. We are the only sovereign people who can speak on behalf of the Jews. So the question of speaking is also related to the division of labor in the Jewish people between the sovereign state and the diaspora, in particular on the concept of anti-Semitism. Because who has the right to speak? Diasporic organization, above all, Anti-Defamation League, American Jewish Committee, American Jewish Congress, are much more equipped in many ways to talk about it than the Israeli state, who is much more interested by nature, be it because of the morality of nations, as Ronald Niebuhr called it, on the issues of the state's interest. So when Prime Minister of Hungary comes to Israel, Orban, and people are saying, Orban, this is a guy who is a fascist. How could Israel host him? And Israel say, we act like nations. If we will host anyone who is if we will not host anyone who is a dictator, we will host no one, because we don't find many democracies nowadays. So we host anyone, but we say it's against the Jewish. Orban. So this is a very important factor to be reckoned with about these two dimensions. I will repeat my last point, which is related to this issue of anti-Semitism, but not completely related, is this domination of the Israeli culture over Jewish culture. A thing which, in my opinion, will grow, not only because of the reality of Israel, which I described, as a Jewish state which is growing, population, power, economics, etc., but also because of the depleted nature of diaspora life. In what respect? In terms of the ability to have communal life. The Jewish people, keep in mind, were always identified by their communal nature, be it defined by them or by others. They define themselves sometimes not in communal nature, but others always define them as a community in that respect. The kinship ties may be sometimes broken, and the concept of Kol Israel Arevim Ze Bazeh, the whole of people of Israel are enmeshed with each other and are also responsible with each other, may be a conceptual understanding. But it also relates to the concept of the outside world, which may be accepting it or not, or the Jews themselves sometimes. This is important also to remember about the concept of who speaks on behalf of the Jews, with what authority, and who listens. All of this takes us back to history. And history is a very good guidance for this analysis. Now, keep in mind, how do we, and where do we start in the business of understanding this type of existence? And one will see, as we will go through history, that this has changed over time with quite interesting twists. Jewish life as we know it, and again there are lots of, and historians here I guess, and you know very well, there are a tremendous debate about Jewish history. First of all, the amount of knowledge that we have on the time of the first temple is in contention constantly. We find lots of things, archaeological diggings, there have been the Finkelstein theories, there is the counter-Finkelstein theories, it's constantly. But the legacy of the Mikra, of the biblical story and the first temple, are still the legacies of the Jewish people. The greatest legacy, of course, that we have experienced, which remained until now a day of mourning, even though I will make a point here, which is Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the temple, the first temple and the second temple, is the days of the loss of sovereignty. I don't know if you know, in the last Tisha B'Av, just a week ago, when was that? 10 days ago? Yeah, 10 days ago. There was a big debate in Israel, because Tisha B'Av is the day that all the state apparatus is closed. People are a sabbatical day to memorize the destruction of the temple. And this is mainly by religious people who are observing it. At that day, there was a big event. You can see the Israeli, huge event in Israel. Anyone knows what was the huge event all over Israel? The gay and lesbian parades against the legislation of the state of Israel that gays and lesbians are eligible to adopt and, I forgot, the surrogates and so on. And everybody said, look at this. This is quite remarkable. The same day of Tisha B'Av, hundreds of thousands in Israel was marking Tisha B'Av, and hundreds of thousands marking with the gay and lesbian flag all over Israel against the government. And people were talking about destruction in two different levels.
And a stone fell out of the wall.
What's that?
A stone fell out of the wall.
Yes. Yes. So you can imagine how colorful Israel is in that respect. They are, and for many people, especially in the religious communities, this has been very painful to watch, because for them, especially the ultra-Orthodox, the destruction of the temple is the most acute issue in Jewish history, which also changed Jewish history as we will see it, of course. And how could it be that on that mourning day, not mourning, but as we mourn this, commemorate this day, the entire country is preoccupied with the legislation about the gay and lesbian surrogate motherhood, or the law of adopting, and so on and so forth. These are two poles which constantly play themselves in the country of Israel as we grow. That's why I said what will happen in Israel will inform Judaism in that respect. I don't know how many in the American Jewry has commemorated Tisha B'Av in that fashion. Maybe yes, maybe no. But I guess only in the ultra-Orthodox community, perhaps the modern Orthodox as well, but in a different fashion. So going back to history, the destruction of the first temple has created a mega shift in Jewish history. And the shift is related, of course, to the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile is the moment when Judaism has moved its gravity from what we call Zera Israel, the seed of Israel, into Zera HaKodesh, into the holy seed. The Babylonian exile, in the absence of sovereignty, as the community tries to maintain itself, as an ethnic identity of a nation, because the Jews were always a nation. Always a nation. They had a patrimony, they had a people, they had a territory, and they had a government in that respect prior to that. Even though they were of course, in the 8th century, the Israel tribes sort of lost to the Assyrian and so on. I'm not going into all history, but this was the nature of being. They had Yoeh, of course, Yehovah, prior, but in terms of a belief, it was the God of the people. After the destruction of the Second Temple, after the time of Yoshiyahu, the Jews moved to Babylon. And especially later on, when the Persians are taking over. The idea of religiosity and the reading of and the sanctifying of the text, a biblical text, is becoming the most critical nature of Jewish identity. That is no longer just based on ethnicity and nationalism, and there's lots of debates. I think they're over. I think it's a footnote. Many people think that the nation state is a modern construction. So I think nowadays, especially in England, we understand it's not. Anthony Smith was the man who began with it. Grosby, of course, my colleague who was here yesterday, Azar Gat, in his latest book, have shown it. Many other scholars are coming to it. There were many nation states. The whole state system existed with identity, with ethnicity, always identified with ethnicity. Was distinguished from the modern nation state, of course, that we didn't have the idea of self-determination, that the individual is at the helm. But the idea that people and state are congruent a la Gellner, of course, it was the whole ancient world was like that. And the Jews were like that as well. Going in, there were big states, small states, etc., empires and so on, but this is a different story. Going into exile and trying to recreate yourself and maintain your identity. The innovative notion of, first of all, keeping the purity of the community on a religious sense. Because in exile, no longer the king of Israel would be reigning. No more kings. The kings will never assume their power again, perhaps until the time of the Maccabees of the 2nd century BC. And even there, they never would like to call themselves kings because they were not anointed by David lineage. And therefore, the Maccabees refused to call themselves kings. They always like to call themselves a Kohen Agadol, the big priest, or the holy priest. The high priest. My mind, I move from English to Hebrew and I translate. You will excuse me. The high priest. So this notion of what we call the 3 crowns of Judaism, everybody likes to call the 3 crowns of sovereignty, the religious crown, the sovereign crown, religiosity, Keter Torah, which is the proshim, the proselyte, and Keter Kehuna, we're starting to shift gears. Religiosity became important, but also you didn't have the temple. In the absence of the temple, worshipping was a completely different story. What's that? The Keter Malchut, the king's crown, Keter Kehuna, the priesthood crown, and Keter Torah, the Torah crown. So what you had is this debate about Keter Torah. But Keter Torah did not exist. The Jews did not know how to read. Reading the Torah was not a practice. Even when Ezra and Nehemiah comes to Palestine, later on, what we call with the Shavei Tzion, the returnees to Zion, with Cyrus. It's not by mistake, ladies and gentlemen, that people like to use the same Cyrus. When President Trump builds the embassy in Jerusalem, he is Cyrus. When Truman recognizes Israel, he is Cyrus. When we get the Balfour Declaration, he is Cyrus. The legacy of Cyrus is a great legacy. I have a whole chapter about Cyrus. We are Cyrus. And they like to be Cyrus because the story of the Bible is so eminent. The idea of Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, who returns the Jews, resumed their sovereignty, and allow them. But people forget, he never resumed sovereignty. When the Jews came from Persia, there was never sovereignty. Ezra and Nehemiah read the Bible, but they never had sovereignty. They came as representative of the empire. They collected money. They collected money for the emperor. They were representative. They built the wall. They built the whole thing as the structure of ethnicity and religiosity. But certainly there was no sovereign control. They had to clean up so to speak, the community, moving the foreign women. And indeed, what you have is Zera HaKodesh, the idea of the holy seed, eventually will become related more to mothers. Never in the life of the Jews of the ancient world, a Jew was by his mother. He was by his father. Eventually, he will become a Jew by his mother. It's a completely different shift. Until today, when you have a debate of who is a Jew, this is a big question. There was no, at that time, any signs of hating the Jews. There was, of course, their minority, lost their power, but they invented a very good story. And the very good stories, as I said, will become even more popular, will be that God is in control. It's a historical God. God controls our destiny. When Jeremiah made his prophet that the Jews will return in 70 years, and the Jews are returning to Palestine, the redemptive moment is that the loss of sovereignty will always have to do with betraying God, but God will find the time and return you. This is the Jewish paradigm in many ways. We go into exile because of what we have done, what because others are doing to us. Everybody will not be surprised that the Jews will be conquered by the Persian, the Babylonian, or the Roman. You should be crazy to be surprised. There are mighty empires who conquer everybody. But only the Jews will tell you they've been conquered and will be redeemed because of their own bickering inside. And it's only a matter of time before God will return them. And this has been a huge, powerful story, which will become the most powerful story in the legacy of anti-Semitism also. Because this was seen to be the story of arrogance.
Just to clarify, so you keep redemption, but in Judaism, redemption is not an afterworld concept.
Not afterworld, but return to the land back.
Right, so this is the notion.
Yeah, redemptive moment where we come, the messianic moment coming back to the land. But think about it. The idea of coming back is a very important idea. We will see how we change over time. But the very notion of that has been a very important feature in Jewish theology. As long as they lived under autonomy, not sovereignty, this big issue was not there. So they were under the Persians, later on under the Macedonians, and so on, all the way until they restored sovereignty in the 161 with Judah Maccabee, sort of like the Maccabees in the creation of a new sovereign state, which lasted 80 years. Netanyahu recently made the point, and we always go back to history, that the Maccabees existed 80 years. After we cross this line, we will see what will happen to us. We constantly refer back and forth in this history. No anti-Semitism whatsoever, the discussion doesn't exist. The discussion also doesn't exist when Antiochus Epiphanes IV is taking over the temple in Jerusalem. Many historians will ask, why did he desecrate the temple? Because it was not part of the practice of the empire to desecrate the temple. They allowed the people to practice their religiosity. And there were many explanations to that, because the Jews were not yielding to power and so on. But there was no discussion of hating the Jews more than hating the others in that respect, or as a particularistic case. Sovereignty was restored, and sovereignty eventually will be lost. And that will be after the period of the Maccabees, and of course Herod's, and the collapse of Agrippas, already in the time of Agrippas, which is in the 1st century AD. You see that there are attacks on the Jews, but not for religious matters, especially in the biggest city of the Jews at that time, Alexandria. Massive. But again, not because of anti-Semitism, as much as because of Agrippa's relations with Rome, and the fact that he could see himself as the best friend of the emperor. Keep in mind that all of Horde's sons grew up in Rome. At the time, the Romans, when they controlled places, they sent the kids of the rulers to Rome to be educated, and also to blackmail, that no one will think about sort of betraying them. This was not a discussion. Even though there were already Jews ready to die, what they call on Kiddush Hashem. Sort of like avoiding the desecration of the name of God, or eating pork for that matter. And you see that already, this phenomena existing. But it was not being perceived as anti-Semitism. The biggest shift, ladies and gentlemen, and you tell me when do you want to take the break, is of course will become with the rise of Christianity, which will take time. Because the rise of Christianity was supposed to put an end to this Jewish paradigm. There will no longer be redemptive moment. The redemptive moment arrived with Jesus. This is Paul's story, which will become enshrined later on in the Roman Empire. That is, you cannot regain sovereignty. You lost sovereignty forever. Sovereignty has been transferred. It's a universal notion. And the fact that Jews refuse to recognize it and move with their theology about the idea of regaining it was perceived to be a blasphemy in that respect. St. Augustine's idea of the Jew as a witness, which will become the creed of Christianity and Catholicism, will be the first to combat anti-Semitism. The whole idea was that Christians cannot stand this notion that the Jews do not accept the Messiah, do not accept the evolutionary notion of history, which came from their own. Don't forget, Jesus was born Jewish and died Jewish. There was no question about that. But the Jews sort of departing was a question of departing out of history. Interesting enough, just as for the Christian, the Jews departed out of history by losing sovereignty, the Jews coming back to Zion and the Jews gaining control over their life in the Zionist tradition is the Jews coming back to history. The language is, we have not been in history as long as we did not control our destiny. That's the language of Zionism more than anything else. Christianity, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, and the explanation of the calamity that befell the Jews after the destruction of the Second Temple, which is fast forward into 70 AD. But of course there will be kind of a hiatus because there was also a revolt, people forget. And it's not by mistake. I write a lot about it and it's a very interesting case. Keep in mind, for example, that the Jews never wrote about the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba revolt is a revolt that took place in 131, 135 against the Romans with tremendous success, mega success. We look at history and we see that the Jews almost defeated the Roman mighty armies and established for 4 years sovereignty with coins, etc. But it's not written by the Jews at the time. Only the Zionists revive it because we took upon ourselves that this was the destruction, the Second Temple, and the Christian, of course, didn't want to talk about it because the destruction of the temple you could not retrieve your sovereignty with Jesus' appearance. But the fight for sovereignty never ended at that time. Many people wrote about it. Maybe Bar Kokhba was kind of like a false prophet. And indeed, Rabbi Akiva called him a prophet. A Messiah, not a prophet. Yeah.
So Harkabi says that Jews didn't write about Bar Kokhba because it was so traumatic.
Yes.
More traumatic than 70. And the rabbis did not want to deal with
The rabbi did not want to deal, absolutely, Mr. Foreman. The rabbi did not want to deal with the idea of regaining sovereignty because the loss of sovereignty was perceived so traumatic that we want to shy away from it and establish ourselves as a religious community. This is so traumatic. Nonetheless, if you look at the history, and all the historians will agree today, all the Jews, notwithstanding in the vicinity of Palestine, including in the Galilee, joined in the Bar Kokhba revolt, including the Pharisite, who were perceived as people who were objecting it. No, we know it today. We got the evidence. They all joined. And that's why it was so successful. In fact, if you look at the Romans, they had to bring the army, you know from where? From Britain. The army was brought from Britain to fight all the way because they were about to lose the battle in Palestine.
But again, I'm interested in this history because Harkabi says, again, Galilee did not revolt. And it was one of the reasons the survival of Judaism, because Judea was devastated.
Harkabi is a distinguished guy. Those of you who don't know, Yoshafat Arkabi was a professor of strategic studies. He was a man of tremendous stature in the Israeli intelligence. Arkabi was wrong. All evidence shows Arkabi was wrong. The historians, not me. I'm not a historian, but if you read all the history, Arkabi wanted to write a point, and this is a very important. He wanted to make a point that if Israel, in the early 70s, and after the Yom Kippur War, etc., will not compromise and will do this and this and this, it will be suicidal. So because we read history backwards and we constantly impose ancient history on our reality, you also make conclusions. At the same time, Igal Yadin, who was, of course, also a very distinguished general and a very distinguished archaeologist and so on. In the past, archaeologues and generals in Israel used to work together. It's very, very interesting in the old days of Israel. Moshe Dayan was an archaeologist. But it's clear. Now, why the Galilee survived, Yavne and its sons, is because the Rabbi Zakkai escaped during this or not. Lots of interpretations. But that doesn't mean that the rebellion in the Bar Kokhba rebellion was not massive. And we know it, and that's why they were so successful. There were no renegades, in fact. And when the sovereignty of the Bar Kokhba period was established for 4 years, it was very well established. When I want to make a point, at that time, you see massacres taking place in Alexandria against the Jews because of their revolt against the Romans. It was related to the diaspora becoming subject to attacks because of what's happening in the land of Israel. It's interesting. But more interesting is, of course, the theological question. And the theological question of the church question, which will become the most acute one for the Jews, is who is in control of history. Now, Augustine, the most important, perhaps, theologian in the church history, St. Augustine, for him, the imperative, al tehargum, don't kill them, the Jews, was always the case because they are the witness to Jesus. They are the historical witness to Jesus. And as a result of that, whenever there was an outburst of attacks against the Jews, those who came to their defense until the 9th century, in fact, were the popes, because of the dictum al tehargum of Augustine, which will change only in the big crusade words in the 10th century and the 11th century, when there's no longer need for the Jews. And then it was free for all. Antisemitism will reign supreme from the 11th century. And if you look at the Jews also, because of the centers, both in Babylon and Jerusalem at the time, this will be the time when all the outburst of anti-Semitism will become so endemic to the Christian world. It was not that there were not attacks before, we have it, but I'm talking about as a theology. It was related this time around to the fact of the depleted nature of the church in terms of its theology. And the Jews, as the exemplar of the other, become the key factor in the definition of the church even before. But anti-Semitism and an explosion of hate that also merit killing of the Jews were only at that time on a massive scale. This type of anti-Semitism, which will grow and will be devastating, will inform much of European continent in the next 5 to 6 centuries. And of course will take shift, and we will talk about it with Luther, with the rise of the Protestant ethics or the Protestant life, which will change the definition of the Jews in that respect, and will make shifts further into modernity. But the idea of the Jews as dispensable needs to be killed, even in this country, kicked out on a constant basis, is basically becoming enshrined only when the Pope, as Ernst Simon and other historians will show us, stopped defending them based on the Augustine dictum of the Jews as witnesses to Jesus. I want, before we go into a break, to make a point that, and one people just underestimate it, but this is the nature of people. When Herzl come to Pius X and address him and say, recognize us as people, and Pius X send him away and tells him, how can I recognize you? You betrayed our Savior, and you did not, and your sovereignty is undermining our entire conceptual understanding. The Catholic Church, in fact, refused to recognize Anna and refused to recognize the State of Israel. One should not underestimate the fact that Benedictus, arriving to Jerusalem as an official visit of the State of Israel and laying a wreath on the tomb of Herzl, recognizing the sovereignty of Israel and the centrality of the Jews, and your friend, Father McManus, from Georgetown, tells me, and I quote him, that this is the most important development in Catholic life since Luther. The very fact that the church recognizing that the Jews have gained sovereignty and they are our elder brother. A complete shift in the Catholic bishops in terms of understanding this all anti-Semitism, which basically informed Catholicism for generations. Now, if there is any exemplar, sort of like example case, to close the first half of my lecture, on the issue of the Israelization of Judaism and the question of anti-Semitism, which we'll elaborate, this is a very important one. Of course, for evangelicals, it's a totally different story. The second coming of Jesus, and therefore they support Israel. They are philo-Semites, so to speak. But for the Catholics, it's a mega shift. What's the name of the movie which was made in Hollywood? What's the, yeah? So you had the whole thing about what's the guy's name? Mel Gibson's movie. Yes. So this was a huge debate. Remember, for anti-Semitism, the Catholics. The church has moved. The church made huge moves. And Rabbi Rosen writes about it, and others sort of like this move. The Israelis, you have to think that the Israelis are absolutely unaware of this historical developments. Because the Israelis live their life. They go to the beach, or they're religious and they don't want to recognize that Christianity even exists. So they hide from it. They see Christian, they will spit or whatever, do something crazy. This is the Israelis. They're religious. Versus the secular who just don't have this historical perspective. But it's a mega shift in the minds and hearts of the church and the state about the recognition of this centrality of sovereignty. We tend to underestimate this kind of evolutionary nature. But certainly anti-Semitism has its roots, its most, I would say, stinging roots in this nature of the church, which saw the Jews as betrayers, those who betrayed Jesus on Golgotha, those who betrayed Jesus' message, those who refused to accept the Messiah, and those who still claim that they have a claim into history even though they lost history altogether. This claim, which was perceived as arrogant or less and less sort of like something which is threatening, will develop further in a completely different fashion among the Protestant, and Luther was the one who will lead it. And of course, will take a complete different shift in modernity with the modern state, with emancipation, and as the last resort with the State of Israel as the exemplar of Jewish existence, which is representing the Jewish nation among nations rather than the Jew among its people. I will take a break here and we will go into break. If there are questions, we'll take them now.
Yeah, so, okay, so Harold will ask a question. I want to make a comment first, if I may. Anyway, I found your presentation fascinating and rich and layered, so thank you.
These are words often used. I never saw someone say, a chair said, I find the presentation dull absolutely devastating and tiresome. So I absolutely appreciate it, Charles, and I hope I hope you believe so too. But that's good. Go ahead.
I was just reading off the script you gave me.
Touche. Yeah. Yeah.
So I just want to make a few quick comments. And I'm reminded of a very brief moment I had with Antisemi walking up the stairs, and we were talking about the liberation of the Jews and Pan-Africanism and how to reestablish notions of sovereignty and some sort of cultural integrity in this sort of post-colonial world and going back to something. And the way you describe the return to history, the return to the land, is really fascinating. And it's it's a momentous, it's a historical momentous, I don't know if it's a miracle or whatever it is, but it's actually incredible. When we're discussing Christian anti-Semitism, racist anti-Semitism, now the rise of political Islam and the demonization of Israel, and to see how far we had to come historically, politically, theologically, it's really astounding what we had to break through to reestablish ourselves.
Yes.
And I'll just say very quickly.
Thank you.
ISGAP has been working with people in the Vatican, and I've met this Pope Francis 5 times in the last 18 months. So we're sort of having this ongoing conversation with members of the Vatican, and we've had the honor of meeting Pope Francis. Laura was with me for the first time we met him, and the first time I spoke to him, we have this agreement with ISGAP and the Vatican to do work on anti-Semitism, and I was staying in Tzfat, and there's 4 holy cities in Tzfat, in Israel, and Tzfat is a holy city, and I was in Tzfat.
Tel Aviv is not one of them.
No. And I told him how I came from Tzfat, and in Jewish custom, you pray at the tomb of the prophets, at the tomb of the tzaddiks, before you go into battle or before you have an important meeting. And I told Pope Francis this. I was at Shimon Bar Yochai's tomb up near Tzfat, and Shimon Bar Yochai and his son played an instrumental role in creating the Kabbalah. And they ran away from Jerusalem. They were traced out by the Romans, and they hid. They were in hiding for many years. They lived in a hole as they were writing their commentary on the Kabbalah. And Pope Francis's eyes lit up, and he certainly knew what I was speaking about. And I said, that the church will only become what the church ought to be when they recognize the foundations of Judaism, that they have to accept us to end the bloodshed. And anyways, that sort of cemented this this odd relationship which we have. ISGAP is sort of, we have state status in the Vatican, which is a bizarre thing how we got it. I'm not sure how we got it. So anyways, the history of Shimon Bar Yochai, what you speak about now, and how the church finally really recognized the sovereignty of the Jewish people in our homeland, on the land, back in our homeland, for Jews to be free in our landscape, in our universe. There is a connection to the land. And I think in a way, this connection has been trashed. At so many levels.
This will be the second part, yes.
I go to speak to my liberal intellectuals up and then friends up in the Middle East Studies department, and it's just, and I see the roots of their distaste for Israeli sovereignty, I think, coming from this tradition and sort of morphed into, say, politically progressive politics. And so what to say? So I think the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty on the land and coming back as indigenous people to the land, and our notions of freedom connected to the land, not our spiritual freedom, not just our physical freedom. We have to be in the land, on the land, to be physically and spiritually free. And that's right. The way you described it, it's like it was a profound
thank you so much.
Description. So thank you. I appreciate it. So how do I ask the first question? We have a long list of questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I am sticking to the script that you passed out. My question goes all the way back to your very opening comments. I was very impressed with the growth and the demographics you
Yes.
had about Israel. My question then is, how does this population growth in Israel relate to that of the nations that border it? How do you have those figures?
How, can you repeat that question for me?
Sure. This whole idea of the population, the
Yes.
growth, numerical reproduction of Israel and its citizens. You know, how does that growth relate to the same phenomenon in those countries that
Are bordering Israel.
are bordering it?
Uh-huh.
Right?
Okay, got you. Look, I was talking about the Jews amongst themselves. When I gave the demographics, I said the first time that the sovereign state of Israel will be, right now it's already the plurality of the Jews are in Israel, will be the majority. I did not make any references to Israel and its neighbors. We have, and I'm sure you have heard about it from experts in the Middle East, and so it's not my lecture. Of course, there is the Middle East around us, and the Middle East also have huge populations, many states, some of which are very much in shambles right now, some of which are massive mega states. Egypt is the number one Arab state, has always been, you know, as a coherent state, even though we know in Egypt also we had tumultuous times in the last few years, but we know there are lots of issues pertaining to Syria, which is absolutely in shambles. We have issues in Lebanon. We have issues which are related to Jordan and its own identity. We have issues in Iraq and so on. It's not the lecture. This is a totally different lecture. It is, of course, clear that the population issue has always been informing Zionism. Because the big question in consolidating the sovereign state of Israel was, will we be able to have a majority of the Jews on this ground? That's why the number one issue for the Jews was securing boundaries and bringing migrants. And the law of return prescribed that everyone who is a Jew is entitled to citizenship. This has brought all those massive migration, which triple Israel population in very rapidly from 48 to 52. And of course, later on was the former Soviet Union and other migrants, and so on. So Israel is a country of Jewish migration. We still have a question in Israel of who is a Jew. But for the sake of migration, anyone who has Jewish ancestry could come and gain citizenship. The big question became eventually, how much or how many Jews will be vis-a-vis the Palestinians or Arab Israelis? A question constantly being asked. This also has come somewhat, the demographics have shifted. Arab Israelis, for example, citizens of Israeli Arabs have declined in numbers. They used to have more kids. They still remain 20% population. But what we call, or what used to be called, the demographic threat is no longer on the agenda in Israel.
But my issue is about resources, and perhaps are we on a collision course? If Israel is growing in terms of numbers and sparse resources there, in terms of land that's fertile, water, those kinds of things, are we, in fact, looking at a precursor to some other types of issues with respect to armed conflict?
Look,
when you're trying to figure out how you're going to feed your people.
there is lots of room. There is, of course, and I don't want to get into it. There is, of course, lots of room, and there is a big debate about Israel in the West Bank, or what the Israelis call Judea and Samaria, and I don't want to get into it. Of course, how much, you know, I study America for many years, and I wrote about America. It always amazed me to see how America used to talk about our absorptive capacities. And I'm a student of American migration. Every wave of migration, America said, we don't have room. And we say, you don't have room. It's quite remarkable. Even small places like Israel still have room. And Israel still consider and still bring, even this week, the Israeli government make a decision to bring the rest of the falashis, those descendant of Ethiopian Jews still remaining them who converted to Christianity but still have and so there is a decision this week on the to bring them to Israel. There is kind of like Israel saw Jewish migrants, even though they don't know if they're Jewish or not, but they call it sort of like for the same as manna from heaven. How much room we have? As I said, Alon Tal in his book said the land is full. Others will say, and I tell you, sometimes you feel the land is full. So many Israelis like to travel. They travel abroad. You see Israelis all over the place. My friends always tell me that people are shocked because they ask people in India, they see all the Israelis traveling in India, and I'll tell you a story, it's a funny story. They travel in India and people say, how many are you? And we said, we are 6 million. They said, no, not in India, in Israel. I said, no, 6 million. I'll tell you, I have to tell you a story. It's a great story coming back from India, I remember. I come back from India, from Mumbai. On the airplane, in the middle of the airplane, there were like maybe 100 people sitting quietly. These are the remnants of the lost tribe of Menashe, one of the 12 tribes, which have been identified as descendant of the Jews from the first temple for the time of the Davidic kingdom. And they're moving to Israel by the law of return. And it was an amazing scene. Next to me was sitting a young Israeli guy, curly hair, with a guitar, who was coming, I guess, being stoned in India and go, I don't know where, for a month and so on. As we approached and the airplane lands, the leader of this group stood up in the most remarkable and emotional fashion in the airplane, said, "Hallelujah, hallelujah, we have arrived." And all his parishioners said, "Hallelujah." I almost cried. The guy next to me said, "Look at the suckers, I don't know where they're coming to." And as the door of the airplane opened up, who was waiting for them? Rabbi Eckstein. Rabbi Eckstein is an American Jew who was building what they call Keren HaYedidut, the foundation of friendship between Christians and Jews in America, bringing Christian money to bring Jews from India to settle in Israel, where this guy, the Israeli, told me, "Look at the sucker." I said, "This is Jewish history, and it's best." It's very picturesque, these pictures. You see it, and when you witness this in this powerful mode, it really gives you kind of like an explanation, which is very difficult to explain in that regard. So, something there is very, very powerful and emotional, and one cannot escape it in that respect. Yes?
Okay, I have two questions. The first one is about this idea of sovereignty, and I'm very interested to have your definition of sovereignty, how that fits into nationhood, and whether the actual term sovereignty plays its part in any sort of contemporary anti-Semitism. I know you're going to be talking about that in the second half. And my second question is, how does this idea of Israelization of Antisemitism play itself out among Israeli diplomats who are posted all over the world?
This is
their relationship with the Jewish community?
Yeah, this is for the second part of the lecture, but I will go only for the first one because I owe you an answer for this. The idea of sovereignty, of course, is related to states. In the modern time, the idea of sovereignty has been extended to individuals. In the old days, of course, sovereignty was also extended to the Almighty. That's why we call him Ribono Shel Olam, our sovereign. God is our sovereign. So now, sovereignty and a political term is, of course, what Max Weber, others called the monopoly over the means of violence within the territory. Sovereignty was always related to who also is in control. The idea that the people and the state should be congruent as a way that the nation and those who control the nation are congruent, this is something which is, of course, as I said, ancient-wise. The idea that people should govern themselves, and they are the sovereign, they govern. It's not, they have the right as individuals, of course, is a modern conceptual understanding. But sovereignty in and of itself is the ability to control, to assert power within certain boundaries which are also in the modern time recognized. So we may have recognition or lack of recognition, but basically monopoly of the means of violence as a state among states. That's why we have, for example, the United Nations. The United Nations is a term which is unapplicable. It's not the United Nations, it should be the United States. But the United States name was taken. In the United Nations, they're not nations, they're states sitting there, right? Only states with flags sitting there. But we call it nations. Nations are entities. What a nation is? A nation is a people, or who are a people, who consider themselves coherent, historically and otherwise, who claim, because of this coherence, to govern themselves in a sovereign state. If they don't make such a claim, they don't have this pretension to govern themselves in many ways. In many ways, when you look at the people of Israel, Ummah and Am. Am is a peoplehood. The concept of peoplehood is different than the concept of nationhood in that respect. And that's why the people of Israel had a claim to modern nationhood with Zionism as a claim that we have to govern ourselves, because all other possibilities have been somewhat unavailable to us, even our desire perhaps to assimilate among nations. So you have forced us to be a Am who claims nationhood. And that's the definitions that one has to understand. People who are not claiming sovereignty, so the Palestinian people who claim to govern themselves, today people understand, whether you like it, you dislike it, that the Palestinians are a nation. There are many other people in the Arab world who contested the idea of a nation. For example, Arab nationalism itself, and we have our Egyptian friends here, Gamal Abdel Nasser, when they had Pan-Arabism, the unity of the Arabs, let's say between Syria, the United Arab the United Arab Republic in 58, or with Libya, etc., people were trying to extend boundaries to the Arab nation. But there is not really an Arab nation, there are Arab people. Whether they will be able to create one state was a big issue. The Ummah, the community of believers that we know, the Islamic notion, of course, consider nationalism as tribalism. It's against the idea of the unity of this Muslim people. So these are very important factors. For the Jews, and that's why the Jewish religion is so unique in that respect. For the Jews, they were always a people, a nation, and a religion, as a completely three elements which are intertwined. Therefore, they were always, as a nationalist people, even when they're in diaspora, they were addressed like this, even if not by themselves. They were trying to run away from it. But others have identified themselves as such. All the way, we will talk about in the second half of the lecture how did it happen and why. But that is a very important factor to understand the centrality of sovereignty in that respect.
Okay. I saw you, Ira. So, Suni, the last question before we go for tea.
Doc, I read an interesting book years ago, Advanced Sermon of the Moors in Spain. And in that book, he captures the 700-year partnership and brotherhood that the Muslims and the Jews shared. And that when you would go to parts of Europe, especially Spain, you could not tell a Muslim from a Jew. And when you even think about the spiritual principles of Islam and Judaism, it's very common in the fact that there's no God but God, there's no intercessor, right, between God and yourself, and that you are responsible for your sins, right? So, do you ever see the region coming together? Because to me, Islam and Judaism has more of a connectivity versus Judaism and Christianity. And I'm thinking that I guess my question is, do you ever see a time where Muslims and Jews are united as they once were in Europe before the Crusades? Because the Crusades not only kicked out Muslims, it kicked out Christians.
Of course.
I mean Jews.
Of course. Look.
Inshallah.
What we say, look, the history of the Jews and the Muslims, maybe we'll get to it, of course, in different fashions. There were like ups and downs, one should understand also. And it's also a question who is reading theologies and so on. I don't want to get into it from the time of Khaybar, from the time of the Prophet with the Jewish tribe and the submission and all these issues. I don't want to get into it. Believe me, it's a huge chapter which so much has been written about it, and I'm not going to do justice to it. But if you ask me about the future of the Middle East, not in my lifetime. You look what happened. It's a tragic evolution we see. One should not underestimate what happened in the Middle East in the last decade with ISIS, with what happened in Syria, calamity, mayhem, issues, notwithstanding conflicts that we have Palestinians and so on, but the gravity of the mayhem and the calamity and the theological hijacking is so that to think right now that one day everybody will sit kumbaya. I am a kumbaya sitter in my nature, but believe me, that is not the trajectory that is forthcoming soon. Maybe, but right now the viral sort of like enmity and the rivalry and between Shiites and Sunnis and so on, so much is at stake that I don't want even to get into it because it will be just like, yes. the lady over there.
So, yeah, I'll put you on the list, but we're going to go for tea now till 11 o'clock.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yesterday I was taking a tour around Oxford. There's a good friend of mine who knows the place and did his DPhil here. And we came across this burial site in what is known as Magdalen College, but used to be known as Magdalen College. But that's at least the stone there said Magdalen College. But it says, I guess they call it Magdalen College. And where the Jews were sort of outside the walls of the city, and they built a site before, of course, they were expelled in 1291. The question of expelling the Jews becomes a very important feature of medieval Europe. And the most, of course, famous expulsion is the Spanish expulsion. It's also a testament to this arbitrariness we talked about, because if you look at history, especially in the case of Spanish Jews, people are often referring to their lives as the golden era of Judaism. The golden era of Judaism is in Spain is one of those celebrated times in Jewish history in medieval times. I forgot who referred before. You referred before the relation with the Muslim community and so on. But obviously it didn't matter in that respect. Calamity will arrive at one point in time. And whether it's because the Visigoths fight with the Muslims, or whether it is related to changes in the church with the Crusaders and so on, serendipity became sort of the idea of Jewish life in Europe. And anti-Semitism will become very much involved with the question of the spread of the Catholic Church in the Crusaders, but also later on, as we develop into the 15th century and into the 16th century, especially after Luther, with the Reformation. Christianity and Judaism is becoming, of course, Judaism is becoming completely dispensable, as I talked about it. There is no longer the protection of the Pope of the Jews as we have experienced it until the 9th century. And if you study the history of medieval Jewry, and there is lots of study of medieval Jewry, you see that you are coming to face communities which sometimes are thriving, sometimes less, with the evolution of the Ständestaat, the cities, the small city-states. You see sometimes Jews appearing. You see more and more what we call court Jews appearing. But by and large, the life of the Jewish community is very, I would say, random in that respect. The longevity of the community, the ability to sustain it, because of this random attacks and the question of the lack of place where they can feel safe is becoming very acute. This was supposed to change in many ways with the Reformation. The Reformation was trying to give a twist to the story, and even Luther initially, as you very well know, perceived to be, because of the enmity to the church itself, to the Catholic Church, perceived that the Jews can become Christians and can be part of our new religion. However, when the Jews are refusing, of course, to accept the deal that Luther presented to them, Luther is writing one of the most, I would say, blasphemous work against the Jews, which becomes the blueprint for modern anti-Semitism. Modern anti-Semitism, which will grow into the modernity, of course, with the thesis of, with the development of anti-Semitism into a racial anti-Semitism. But prior to that, we are witnessing shifts in Europe where the Jews are making headways in some ways because of the decline of the Catholic Church on the one hand, and also because of the rise of, one can argue, a new tradition in the Protestant Church, which we call the Hebraist tradition. From the 16th century on, especially after the 30-Year War, we see that more and more theologians and eventually political philosophers are looking at the Jews, and the Protestants of course, are looking at the Jews and Jewish history as a way of envisioning the future. This will become even more interesting during the discussion in the 17th century over the Westphalian arrangement, the arrangement of nation-state. In this country, for example, you see many of the political philosophers are becoming very much equipped with Jewish history, biblical history, and considered Jewish sovereignty as even an option for the future. We see it from Hobbes, we see it from Grotius, and of course, we see even the possibilities of establishing a Jewish state 300 years before Herzl as a way of thinking about it without the Jews being involved, as a way of thinking what will be the model of the state, the future state. At the same time, almost simultaneously, you see the viral anti-Semitism that's spreading all around, especially in Germany. In 1602, for example, you see a pamphlet which is circulated wide all over Europe, arriving even to North America, the Old North later on, is a pamphlet called Achashver. It's a pamphlet of the concept of the wandering Jew. The concept of the wandering Jew, of which I'm writing now the whole thing about, this conceptual understanding of the rootless Jewish person who doesn't have a place to be, is becoming almost viral all over, and it reconstitutes the story of a man who betrayed Jesus on his way to Golgotha. It's being seen all over the place. And you see massive expulsion from different German cities almost overnight because of this phobia that you see over in Europe. Quite interesting. And this is at the time when discussions are taking place of what to do with the Jews, also in terms of integrating them, seeing them in a different light, including in this country. 350 years after their expulsion, the Jews are being admitted by Cromwell here. And there is a discussion about them, and there is even some empathy toward them. But all of this is when the Jews are not players in this game. Anti-Semitism, therefore, is inflicted all over the place, and this is at all without discussing at all the Jews of the East. This is all in Western Europe. The question of institutional anti-Semitism is, of course, been asked many, many times during that period of the 16th century after the 30-Year War and so on. And many times the Jews were also, because they were not being able to carry any official job, they were what they call court Jews. They used to be dealing with all sorts of jobs that are related to small trade, and they were a very important factor, especially after the 30-Year War, as a way of lenders, because they were the easiest place to rob. In feudal times, you could take the money at will in many ways. And as a result of that, you see on the other hand that if you rob them, you cannot really utilize them, and as Louis Koser has written extensively about. So you start to develop some relations with court Jews. Court Jews is a very interesting institutional design, that people are adopting them, they will produce money, they will be exchanging money, they will keep money, they will trading silver, they will trading silk, all kind of like trade. And you can, so some Jewish families are becoming more and more kind of like getting closer to the elites, because the elites are using them. But even that period, as Koser and others have demonstrated, will end up in calamity, because the next king, the next feudal system that will come will not remember this, and therefore serendipity will still be the case of their life. Only when you see the development after the arrangement of Westphalian states, and that's a very important period, Westphalian state in 1648, trying to create states along religious lines in a way of establishing stable sovereignty. This was the time, and I recently published a big essay about it, to see how suddenly the Jewish state became a discussion among the architect of Westphalian negotiators, which I never knew about. There is a lot of literature about the Hebraists, Locke and Hobbes and Montesquieu, and before that, of course, Baudin and others, who are discussing the Jewish model of sovereignty for the construction of European sovereignty. But there is very little kind of talk about what to do with the Jews, rather taking example from ancient Jews, what to do with the Jews in the early periods of modernity. At that time, what you see, voices which are coming to challenge the church itself and the Christian dogma, started to think about, can the Jews be integrated? I think the most important essay that you probably heard about and became circulated all over Europe at the time was Van Damme's essay on Jewish life. Van Damme's essay, which was published in the early part of the 18th century, was all over Europe, saying perhaps we will be able to reform the Jews. The Jews can be reformed if we only, their anti-Semitism and the way we have placed them in society did not allow them to integrate. But if we release them, and it's not releasing them from their religiosity, release them, allow them to integrate and make their religion subsidiary, sort of like to their life, maybe they will be able to live among ourselves. This is becoming a big talk on the Jews, and the anti-Semitism is no longer so much stressing the religious component, but rather the Jew as the other, the Jew as a traitor, the wandering Jew and with his character, the character of the Jew rather than his religion. The character of the Jew is becoming more and more part of the discourse, and you see it all because of the re-emergence of new system in Europe. There is, of course, at the time, with the approaching of modernity discussion, you can see them later on in Kant, and of course later on in Hegel, you see that people are starting to deal with Jewish religion in a different fashion, and criticizing Jewish religion as remnant of the past. And the Jewish people themselves, of course, are undergoing tremendous changes. Everybody here, I'm sure, is familiar with the story of Mendelssohn, the big Jewish intellectual of the 18th century, and how he's wrestling with the idea of maintaining Judaism as a religion, which will be kind of like a rational religion. Can Jews become a rational religion, which is not interrupting with the idea of rationality and modernity, which is part and parcel of the thinking of the Enlightenment? Kant, of course, thought that there is no need of the Jews. We have to, basically, they are like antiquated. We have to get rid of them. The language is shifting. It's not a criticism of religiosity. It's a shifting, the language is shifting as enmity toward modernity. The Jews are remnants of the past in that respect. Of course, always the Christian element is there, but it is not, because Protestants are representing modern Christianity. Modernity and rationality and religious belief can be living side by side. What you see is basically a discussion of what to do with the Jews as a way of trying to usher in the modern state, what we call. And the Jews are becoming an issue vis-a-vis the modern state, vis-a-vis the new state, because they represent the significant other to the state. They don't represent part of what we call the nation, the people. They are not also part of the religious community as Westphalia organized the state. Westphalia organized the state according to religion. Even though Westphalia was a peace, Westphalia was defined as a Christian peace. Peace among Christian nations. And even though they define as a Christian nation, the Jews are being mentioned there many times. It's quite interesting, because they're kind of like standing out as the significant other in Westphalia. This issue, of course, will lead us to what we call the modern anti-Semitism. What to do with the Jews, all the way to the period of emancipation, which became, so can the Jews really be citizens of the state? What we call the Jewish question. I would argue, as a forward-looking, that today there is no longer a Jewish question. In my book, I showed that basically the Jewish question is dead. Today there is an Israeli question. No one is asking whether the Jews can be citizens in the world. And of course, this question was the question which was asked by the Zionists and others in modernity, all the way to the Holocaust and beyond. And today there is no more a Jewish question. There may be a Muslim question in France. There may be Jewish anti-Semitism in France because of lots of things, but there is no Jewish question in France when you study it. There is really no Jewish question in England. There may be Corbyn hostile to the Jews because he had 3 million voters who are non-Jews who don't like Israel, whatever it is, but it's not the Jewish question of England. England has other questions to wrestle with. The Jewish question, ladies and gentlemen, is a very interesting question because it got numerous dimensions, which basically also redefined the concept of anti-Semitism or the discussion over anti-Semitism. It can define it, for example, can you be a loyal citizen? Are you committed to religion as opposed to committing to the rule of law, which is more or less Protestant state? To what extent you can be universal and not particular? These were the questions we're asked. How much are we willing to absorb you as part of us without you remaining what you are, or even if you are shifting gears and changing your nature? Eventually, can you at all change your nature because it's perhaps racial tenets of your nature? These discussions, you will be surprised or not, and I tell you all my secrets, but don't tell anyone, have been discussed, and I describe it in a chapter I write. My book is not out yet, but soon, I hope, in the Congress of Vienna. In the Congress of Vienna, about arranging Europe, suddenly you see Metternich and Humboldt and the rest of the gang disappearing for 10 days just discussing the Jewish question. I said, what the heck is that? I didn't know. No one knew. I asked people, did you know that? I have all the documents. Because Germany was not united and many German states were existing and each and one of them were trying to remain independent of this unification, and they wanted to have a helm of the Jews. And in fact, in that respect, many people discuss, for example, emancipation. When was the emancipation given? There are many historians here. When was emancipation given? It's not a quiz, but was given after the French Revolution, right?
Yeah, under Napoleon.
Napoleon. So people talk about the emancipation of the Jews in Germany and in France. I'll tell you the story. There was never emancipation in Germany until 1862. People didn't know it. The emancipation of Jews in Germany was because of Napoleonic conquering. Napoleon himself enshrined it, but the German canceled it very quickly in 1815. You discover certain things which become kind of like almost trivia, but they're not so trivia. The idea of Jews being equal citizens is being discussed in this country, of course, prior to that. Cromwell, of course, is reinstating them. And you have a whole theory of even of philo-Semitism. Suddenly the Jews are becoming kind of like an exemplar of something, when the love of the Jews will become, but it's very minor. Anti-Semitism will morph and will change, of course, the more the Jews are becoming empowered. Even though there was no official emancipation in Germany, when you read the history of German Jews, from the beginning of the 19th century toward the end of the 19th century, you see that they are at the bottom of the echelon of the society, really at the bottom, and in 50, 60 years, they're on the top of the echelon of the society. There is a kind of like an explosion of using these new freedoms that are granted against perhaps the grain of the state to elevate yourself into the upper echelon of society. With cases such as the Rothschilds were becoming sort of like the story of the Jews. An explosion of Jewish sort of money as a way of kind of like empowering the Jews, with the idea of court Jews and new court Jews becoming very much advanced in all over Germany and of course in France, less so in England, because they were always a community, and it's also the question who controlled them. In England there was the Board of Deputies as a way of official governing. In France, of course, Napoleon, of course, initiated the emancipation, but very quickly was very worried about the Jews, because Catholics warned him that the Jews will be traitors. So in 1808, Napoleon is establishing the consistoire. The consistoire is in fact recognizing ethnicity in France, as the Jewish wanted to isolate them, that he will be controlling them. The fear of the Jews remained there, but they're also pushing themselves forward in society. And what you see in Western Europe, in fact, is fleeing Judaism by Western Jews. The ability to become integrated. And this is much before Jews started to come to the United States, even though they are already in the United States. And you see them, the question of Jews in the United States is being a very important question later on, which will be during the Civil War in the United States. Sarna just finished a beautiful book on the Jews during the Civil War. Lincoln and the Jews. I don't know if you saw this book. It's a great book. But the Jews are, are flying high in that respect. This is all different than where the majority of the Jews are. And the majority of the Jews are in the East. We usually tend to speak about anti-Semitism, about Jews and emancipation in the West. But keep in mind that the Jews are in the Russian Empire after the breakdown of Poland in 1795 and 1793, and the Jews are basically becoming an important feature of the Russian Empire as because of the laws that are relocating them to the Pale of Settlements. That's a totally different story, because there you didn't have anti-Semitism so much. The Jews were away from the main population. Only with Nikolai I, you start to see East European anti-Semitism exploding, with fear of the Jews and the desire to recruit the Jews to the army. The East European case of the Jews is a completely different story than the story of anti-Semitism that evolved in the West. In the West, it's all related to the evolution of the Western society. The Jew is becoming an exemplar of what we call the European Jewish question. There was no same Jewish question in the East. The Jewish question was very much the question of modern, democratic, Western capitalist states, with remnants of Christianity. But different questions were asked. They were asked about the nature of politics, integration in society, and it became all involved also the question of economics. With Karl Marx on the Jewish question, I don't have to give you all the history, is becoming sort of one of those poisonous essays about the Jews and the equation of the Jews with money. So we have undergone a metamorphosis of the Jews, who are not player in world affairs at all, suddenly becoming sort of citizens, not yet players, but people are talking about them as things that are affecting the arrangement of the modern state or the modern nation state in the West. And in the East, they're becoming an issue which will become, I would say, very poisonous for maintaining the empire's control of the Russian Empire. Still very much on a religious level, because the Jews, until the 19th century, were all in many ways religious Jews. It was very few people were not religious Jews, because they were segregated, they lived in communities. I don't have, it's kind of a Jewish 101, but I don't have to tell you about the case of Spinoza. Spinoza is the first secularist, so to speak, was a unique case. Unique case. Spinoza was raising question of rationality of the modern state and so on, but it's a unique case. It's not representing who the Jews are, who are completely sort of like... Mendelssohn is a very interesting case, because Mendelssohn's sons were already converting to Protestantism, to Christianity. What prompted Herzl in the Dreyfus affair, some people think it's what is all about, sort of like talking about the modern Zionism is related to what prompted Herzl was the Dreyfus affair in the late 19th century. But of course, the question of Zionism and the question of the Jewish state and the fear of anti-Semitism existed all around Europe, and it started to make headways also in the East, especially when the East was changing, when Russia was facing challenges, when Nikolai died, when the Jews could suddenly become more and more active in the outskirts next to, think about Odessa and other places, the Jews could really make headways. All the way to the pogroms in 1882, 1880, 1882, and what is happening. And that will lead to a complete shift in Jewish history. You already had people speaking Hebrew, you had Smolansky, you had Mapu, you had lots of things that were happening. But by and large, an explosion of the quest of sovereignty as a solution to the Jewish question. Think about that in 19th century, everybody was asking questions. The 19th century was all about question. The Eastern question, the Polish question, this question, that question, and the Jewish question. Sovereignty became, this important factor of discussing the Jews. Is the sovereignty the solution to the Jews? And I think what you have is two things happening. One is, as I suggested early on in my comments, that there is a state as a solution, the Herzlian idea. The other is, of course, the American case. America was the first time when Jews were not facing massive anti-Semitism. There were anti-Semites, of course. There were the Ku Klux Klan. But in America also, the Jews were not the lowest in the echelon of society. African Americans were suffering more, of course. And that was always a case that the Jews could more integrate it. And there was, of course, the question of receptive notion of America as a state which was more freer than others. The idea of a state which was not ethnic by nature. Was not ethnic by nature. There was no, in Russia, all the way through the 19th century, of course, the Russian church, the Orthodox Church was dominating. The fact that anti-Semitism was now exploding in Europe as a question, and America became the solution to it, was a very interesting case. And of course, the world changes, and therefore anti-Semitism and the answers to it also relate to world politics. I don't want to go into lots of discussion about the Balfour Declaration, self-determination, nationalism, but of course, this issue is the issue at the same time as the Jews are making headways. Anti-Semitism is becoming so viral in terms of its racial manifestation, leading to the Holocaust. Just at the height, the peak of the Jews, making headways in the Western world, they're being hit, the biggest hit perhaps ever. As I said, the idea of the Gewalt syndrome, notwithstanding where you are, you're being hit. And it was also in it was also in Russia. In 1882, many Jews felt they can become even integrated. There were theories of integration. Even after 1882 and after the Kishinev pogroms, you still have the Bundist. You still have the autonomous Jews. You still have Dubnov. You still have theories that say we can integrate. We can work with this state. It's part and parcel. There is a solution there. Zionism was, in fact, when Zionism finally managed to establish the state in 1948, was kind of like, as Ben-Gurion made the point, all of these solutions are fictitious. They are part of the Jewish disease of not understanding anti-Semitism. The disease was not just the Goyim's disease, was not just like the others, it's our disease. We did not understand. And we had to go, and the discussion in Zionism was always how we have to undergo transformation. And mostly this transformation was based on the writings of foreigners, of Van Dom and others we took from them, about how we have to change ourselves, our character. We have to conquer the land. We have to work. We have to be authentic. We have to be dwellers rather than Mercurians and wandering Jew. All of this was basically became part of the creed of Zionism itself, who adopted in many ways the language, not of anti-Semites, but the language of the sicknesses of the Jews, which others ascribed to them in the diaspora. The Zionists ascribed to them all the way going into to Auschwitz. That is also this is also why the negation of the diaspora, the negation of the galut, of exile, is so enshrined in the language of Zionism. And the creation of the people of Am Ivri, a Hebrew people, as opposed to Jewish people, a modern people, was so critical into the shifting nature of avoiding anti-Semitism. In many ways, we will solve the anti-Semitic problem because we'll create a state. And when Herzl is appealing for that, he said, we will solve your problem. Not only our problem, we will solve your problem. That's how we're appealing to others to recognize it. And we haven't say anything about the Islamic world and Jews in the countries of Islam, both in Asia and in especially in Africa. There were outbursts here and there, we know. I came back from Morocco last March, I think it was, or May, I forgot when I was there. March, I think, yeah. Trying to understand, and you see, but you see the Jewish in the Berbers community, you see in the port cities, you see in Essaouira and other places, but they were thriving in many ways, but they were also suffering from time to time outbursts, but in a different fashion. The ideology was not there. The creation of the State of Israel was, in fact, the solution to the Jewish question, which was, of course, too late. The creation of the State of Israel came too late. They could not save the Jews from Europe, and that was the big issue. They could not save the Jews of Europe, which were slaughtered because of viral anti-Semitism, which became racial anti-Semitism. In the United States, of course, anti-Semitism was always there, but it was on the sideline. There was not really risks to the Jewish people en masse, because it was not sanctified by the regime. It was not really granted immunity by the regime, like it was granted in France, for example, like it was granted in Germany, like it was granted in a different fashion in England before. It was not institutional in the same fashion. Only later on it was institutionalized. So we are coming back to my title, The Israelization of Antisemitism. The Israelization of Antisemitism, my title, is basically making the point that with the domination of the State of Israel over everything Jewish, with the evolution of the State of Israel as the majority of the Jewish in the world, with the depletion or with the decline, any way you want it, of the Jewish life in the diaspora vis-a-vis Israel in particular, even though American Jewry, no one thinks the American Jewry is declining in that respect. Declining in terms of like their success. The greatest success of American life is what basically breaks the communities. Keep in mind the Jewish life is all about community. If you don't live a communal life, what does it mean to be Jewish? It's very tough to be Jewish if you don't build a communal life. Liberal Judaism in America is basically fighting against the idea of the communities breaking apart. That's the big challenge. Can you keep the communities intact? When I go to shul, to services in Rosh Hashanah in New York, to what is known as the New Shul, I'm always amazed by the effort made, by the successful effort to bring the community, to hire a school, to keep services, all volunteering. It's very tough. It's very tough. In France, it's a different notion, of course. In Britain, there is an organization, the Jewish community. But in America, there is no such communities, especially as the Jews make so much headways. In Canada, you still have communities. But the liberal type, of Judaism is very much wrestling with this kind of like, how do we maintain communities? Because ethnicity is very difficult to maintain. Jewish ethnicity, if you are not religious, so how do you maintain? And if you intermarry, it's very difficult. And if you don't have the Mamalushan, the old language of the Mama, which is sort of Yiddish, there is no more Yiddish speaking in America. So you maintain, how do you maintain institutions around what? And if you go to colleges and you integrate, by nature, that's what happened. This notion of anti-Semitism, therefore, has to be understood, especially along the lines of I would say, the end of the Cold War also. During the Cold War era, of course, there was anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. There was Soviet anti-Semitism. There was also the time of the Cold War, a bit prior to that, of Jewish communities which still exist, let's say in Syria, in Iran, before the revolution. So communities were always vulnerable. But today, nowadays, how many Jewish communities in the world exist outside the Western Hemisphere? When they are targeted, and they have been targeted, oftentimes they've been targeted along the lines of the question of Israel. Not if it's right or wrong, in terms of like how you interpret it, whether it's true Israel or Jewish hate, but that's what happened in Argentina, that's what happened in terrorist attacks in France, this is what happened. Anywhere you see it, this is what it is. In America, it's a different story because anti-Semitism in America, one has to study it. I'm not an expert on anti-Semitism in America, but it's a different type. The last couple of years have raised some issues. I haven't studied it carefully to see how deep it is, what we call the alt-right and so on. I really don't know much about it now. I know that there were like questions, of course, always related to this, and I'm reading about it, but this is the case. So the Israelization of anti-Semitism is the centrality of Israel of the Jewish world. Is the understanding that what Israel does impact the Jews, and in fact the Jewish world is completely tied to Israel whether they like it or not. The ability to separate between Israel and the Jews in the world is very difficult. It's difficult because it's almost perceived by people as one, the Jewish people. It's also because of the great support that Israel enjoyed by the diaspora, always have enjoyed it, and enjoyed it mostly after the 1967 war, when there was an explosion, when Israel power was seen in the Six-Day War so immense, many Jews kind of like came to the fold and became really, I would say, pro-Israeli or pro-Zionist in a completely different fashion that they have known before. The Jewish people coming to Zionism, of course, was a process in the diaspora, because Israel was seen as something, a success and so on, but nevertheless, we have established ourselves in Canada, in America, perhaps even reinventing ourselves in Europe, even though we have witnessed Vichy that singled out the Jews, even though we have experienced the racial, but Israel is there as a way of protecting us, but also Israel is a country that is separating us, and all the Jewish question of the past is no longer also fashionable. Racism was no longer fashionable. The question of Israel with anti-Semitism is becoming, of course, related also at the time to what happened in the Arab world, the massive migration of Jews from the Arab world, escaping the Arab world as a result of the war of 1948. So the shifts are there, and of course, what happened, as I suggested, under Stalin and in Soviet Russia. Making matter kind of like condensing them because of the clock, and I want to leave time, is like when all these communities are basically, because of anti-Semitism of the past or because of Israelization, whatever, moving. Israel, the dream of the Zionist state, is becoming more consolidated. Massive migration from Morocco, from Iraq, from Yemen, you name it, all over came to Israel. Big migrations. and of course, eventually from the former Soviet Unions. And even from America. We had after 67, I just read this book, interesting book on the settler movement and American Jews. I didn't know that 60,000 of them are in the West Bank. Interesting enough. So what is the story of Israel and anti-Semitism? Can we discuss it in the same fashion? This is the big issue. Can we make the old anti-Semitism and the new anti-Semitism, the Israelization of it, in the same category? Many, many books have been written about it. Many, you are conducting this seminar, I guess, in this fashion, because if you look at the world, think about England today. Would you make the question of the Jewish question of England, with Corbyn, whatever, it's not the same question. No one is fearing that there will be sanctified attack on the Jews by the British government, God forbid. Or if the Prime Minister of France said, if the Jews will leave, France will never be France. Or the President, if it's Sarkozy, if it's whoever it is, they will never they will not, let alone of course now in Germany and so on, you will not see it. You will see sometime outbursts. You will see sometime in urban Hungary, a sign of, what's his name, the philanthropist, Soros. But, so you see, there are remnants, but attacks which are sanctified by regimes against the Jews, I don't think you can see today. It's because there is no room for that in Western Europe, and there are no Jews in other parts. It's interesting. There are very few Jews left in Iran for that. So they may be talking, but very few. But no Jews, of course, in Syria. There used to be a large community. And I was in Morocco. In Morocco now, they said there may be 2,500 Jews, and they are being guarded by so many police officers. It's quite remarkable. I went to Friday night shul in Casablanca with Andre Azoulay, who is the king's emissary. He's Jewish. It was almost like, you entered the synagogue. It's like an event from the past. And Israelis are storming Morocco as tourists. So more Israelis in Morocco than ever before. But there is no Moroccan community. There are no communities anywhere in the Arab world for that matter. So it's all related to the state of Israel and what is Israel representing. To begin with, I would say that the religious anti-Semitism, with Christianity, as I started to talk about it, shifted. I don't see today Catholic anti-Semitism as rampant as it was. I think it's depleted. I don't know if it will disappear, but it's completely, the story is depleted. The strength of Israel forces the church to change its behavior, the Catholic Church. There are still bastions of Protestant anti-Semitism in certain churches, which are more related to the progressive kind of politics. But among the evangelicals, I don't have to tell you. Evangelicals have kind of made Israel almost as part of their identity, of their religious identity. The success of Israel, the idea of Israel consolidating its hold over territories and so on, they're celebrating it. It's not by mistake that when you celebrate the opening of the American embassy in Jerusalem, that Hagee and others, leaders of the evangelicals, are sitting there. For them, this is really the reincarnation of sort of like their own story of Christianity, all the way to the second coming of Christ. I once asked Abe Foxman at the time of the Second Intifada, I said, there was lots of criticism by liberal Jews about this alliance of certain Jewish communities with the Christian right because of the evangelicals. And I said, how do you explain it? They want eventually to convert you in the end of the days. So Abe Foxman told me, Yossi, when we get to the end of the day, we will renegotiate. So I said, right now, these are our allies and we appreciate their support. Eventually, let's talk about it. So you cannot, it's a kind of like a different story. And nevertheless, what you have is the delegitimation of the state of Israel. A viral delegitimation. This delegitimation, of course, is borrowing from a different type of language. And it penetrated, of course, different quarters of the world. Of course, there is, what I call the radical Islamists, and this is a different story, I don't want to get, it's delegitimation of Israel, and that kind of like is endemic, it's so powerful, and of course prior to that, Arab nationalism, before we have arrived in some deals with Egypt and Jordan, etc. Israel is an illegitimate entity as a bastion of colonialism in the Middle East. That's how it was described. And also because Israel is the solution to the Holocaust, and that's what it is. That's how it was described. That Israel came to solve the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe. We are not anti-Semites, but that's it. But at the same time, even Arab nationalists could not escape the language of anti-Semitism. Think about Mahmoud Abbas. Just recently, Abu Mazen, the leader of the Palestinians. When he goes for 2 hours in a viral attack against Israel and its policies, it became a viral attack against the Jews. But as I write, it doesn't pay off today to attack the Jews like that. It backfired big time, even among those who are detractors of Israel, including in the New York Times, etc. They said, how could you be anti-Semite? Criticize Israel, but don't be anti-Semite. And he kind of like said the Jews were always like this, and the Jews were always, he put kind of traits on the Jews. So the language is very much there in the delegitimation of Israel. It's part of the language, because you cannot, how would you describe Israel's illegitimacy? You can describe it as what? Neo-colonial, so you describe it as neo-colonial. You can describe it as expansionist, but that is how it ends as a conflict. But the hatred, which became so viral among many, is because there is kind of like remnants of the old anti-Semitism, of the European kind of anti-Semitism, of the church-like of anti-Semitism, depends where you come from. And that kind of penetrated into the third world in one time. Okay, we'll open for questions. The state of Israel, for years, refused to deal with anti-Semitism. As I suggested to you, this was not our fight. Once everybody will be here and will be strong, anti-Semitism will dissipate. It is your, just a second. Anti-Semitism will dissipate because people will recognize it. In many ways, I think this vision is true. You see today that Israel has tremendous relation with people in India, with people in China, with people all over the world. And this language is not at all, on the contrary. In these countries, sometimes you become embarrassed by the old Jewish stereotypes, which are so embedded in the language. When you come to China and tell you, you Jews, smart, very smart, Arab, not smart. You say, don't talk like this. This is not right talk. This is not Western type of talk. But this is how in China sometimes they talk. And we criticize it. It's not PC to talk like that. But this kind of like talk, and it's all business talk. It's not like it was Donald Trump who called men's club talk. Yeah, in a different fashion. Locker room. Yeah. But this is, and this is on the side. We really don't feel there is no really questions of anti-Semitism when Israel deal with it. What you have is the question of what happened in the Middle East and power. And of course, the Europeans are not settled yet about their past, and are not settled yet about Israel and its relation with the Arabs. Issues can come to the fore. In other countries, for example, when I go to South Africa, we have someone from South Africa. Yeah? Yes. What you see, that Israel is becoming almost identical in the language of South African, and I said it to the Vice President of South Africa and others, with the issue of apartheid. They laid on Israel the claim of apartheid, and it catches. And then you identify Israel as apartheid, and I say you are selling apartheid too cheap. What do? What, we are racially excluding people? No, and it's becoming, it's before, because the nationalist movement, the Palestinian nationalist movement and others have kind of captured certain phrases which become very much undermining the very legitimacy of the Jewish people to have a state and to have independence. When this is catching so much, especially in what you call progressive forces, it can easily, I would say, become anti-Semitic, and you see it. For years, the idea of a taboo was the subject of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was kind of becoming what I call a universal memory. You had to honor the Holocaust. And both in Israel and others knew, so like, if you attack us on this issue, you absolutely... Nowadays, it's the language of the Holocaust. You're conducting a Holocaust. You're conducting a Shoah, the Palestinian Shoah. You're basically attacking the collective memory of the Jews as a way of undercutting the very legitimacy. This language certainly is becoming anti-Semitic. You basically reduce the life of the Jews, something which is, they should be dispensable. Describing the Israeli action as something which is genocidal. Basically undermining the very moral fabric of the State of Israel as justifying the delegitimation of the Jews, including Jewish power, which is an American issue. Jewish power is those Jews who are supporting an apartheid state. Those Jews are supporting Israel, are taking themselves away from the liberal creed of America, and they themselves should be the target. That's the language of the left. When I go to see, and I'm amazed to see, when I was following people at the Sanders campaign, I was shocked to see that the language of Israel was not mentioned at all. Israel was kind of a viral name. And this is Bernie Sanders, who constantly also, you saw it in England, even among some of the Jewish candidates. Miliband candidacy in this country, himself, Ed Miliband, was condemned by the Jewish community because he was almost adopting this language. When Mr. Corbyn said that Hamas and Hezbollah are our best freedom friends, it's of course the case that Israel is a criminal state and adopting the other criminals as a way of Israel, undoubtedly. And that is kind of giving license to all kind of theories. This type of anti-Semitism is therefore definitely related to Israel, even though Israel may be doing certain things which could be debatable in Israel and outside Israel. But it's certainly this type of legitimation is targeting the diaspora. The diaspora has become what I call the soft belly of Israeli security. In 2001, I wrote 2 essays about the Jewish security dilemma, describing how the case of Israel and the Second Intifada is kind of becoming more and more the case of the Jews, the Jewish security abroad, with attack on the Jews and others, because they are the soft belly. You cannot attack them, you will attack them in different places, including, of course, as I suggested already, as I said 3 times already, the big explosion of the Jewish Community Center in Argentina. The second issue is, of course, of who speaks on behalf of the Jews. I will 1 minute. Whether Israel represents the Jews or not. For many people, Israel represents the Jews whether they like it or not. When the Israeli ambassador to France will come to Toulouse or to Lyon, the mayor of Lyon will say to the Jews in Lyon, here with us today is your ambassador. We say, our ambassador? We're French citizens. What do you mean our ambassador? When I come to Argentina to speak, the Israeli ambassador said, we, and the people of Argentina said, what do you mean by that? We're Argentines. So the big question of where do you belong is also the question of Israel and the Jews themselves. How much we want to be part of it, how much not. South Africa is a clear case, because and of course in the Arab world there is, and especially among Islamists, there is never a distinction between Israel and the Jews. In that respect, and I come full circle, the strength of Israel, the fact that there is no longer arbitrariness but rather more stability, the fact that there are no longer the Jewish people are assembling in the State of Israel and the Jewish communities around the world are mainly in the West and are protected in that respect, is making the case of anti-Semitism much more related to Israel. In that case, this is the Israelization of antisemitism. This case needs, of course, and Charles and others are doing this study constantly, seeing how much it penetrates the old language, how much you separate, and you see when the labor, and this is my last point, is negotiating what will be, think about, what will be the blueprint of our relation to anti-Semitism. Why it should be a question? It's because there is something there which is somewhat remnant of the past, but is also injecting Israel into it, and it's also British politics. It may be something that needs to be addressed in a most aggressive manner by these states. Israel is always telling everybody among the Jewish people, we told you so. We told you so. So, pack and come. That's what they say. Basically the message, pack and come. And of course, there is, if we talked about the Jewish people, my last sentence, we are now 14.5 million, more or less. More or less. 92% are in Israel and the United States. In Israel, 46 will be more than 50. So the rest is kind of like anecdotes of sorts. This, I think, trajectory will continue. And the subject matter will be much more related to Israel. And the story will be mostly related to negating the past, especially the Holocaust. The assault on the Holocaust as a collective memory will grow as we are moving away from the event. Because those who maintain it as the bastions of legitimacy will not be able to protect it as we were able to protect it in recent decades in a certain fashion, especially American Jewry, who themselves are somewhat puzzled by their own identity, their relations to Israel, Israeli politics, Israeli behavior, their own behavior, and so forth. I'll stop here. Thank you.
So there's a lot of questions, and we have about 20, 25 minutes. But really, Yossi, thank you very much. I think you illuminated in a very rich way so the strands of issues of anti-Semitism in the contemporary context that we've been dealing with.
Yes.
And you really it sort of illuminated the roots and the strands, which is in a very comprehensive and serious scholarly way. So thank you. So the first question to Maya.
Yes, this isn't a question, but it's rather a comment. We are here on studying anti-Semitism and about anti-Semitic language, and it would be remiss of me not to point out certain things, such as when you asked a question regarding numbers of Jews, and there's this implicit understanding in that question of this conspiratorial understanding that Jews are growing in numbers and they're going to overtake territories. And so just as Carlton before talked about, certain ways that language can inform a sort of microaggression, I think, because we are in a class on anti-Semitism, to understand that implicit in questions like, well, the Jews are growing in numbers and they're going to overtake more territories, it's very much a trafficking, a little bit of a protocols of elders of Zion kind of thinking. That's all I wanted to.
Can I respond?
Yes.
That's absolutely wrong. Here's my thing. When you have communities growing, at some point, there's going to be a concern about how do you allocate resources. And part of my question was, what about the growth rate with respect to the people who are bordering Israel, and even those who might be inside of Israel, who might be, non-Jewish? My question is, at some point, there are going to be some issues with respect to how you allocate resources. And my question was, what might that phenomenon, how does it turn into questions about perhaps clashes? So it's not a matter of something being anti-Semitic. People got to have resources to live. They got to have water, they got to have land, they got to have food. And Israel is not exempt from that.
I will just say, I think I'm with you. I think the question of the Middle East and is a big question. Look, people are always worried about resources. In this country, Malthus was worried also once. There is no problem, I would say there is no problem of resources. There is, the big question, what the lady was saying is, I disagree, if I may. I don't think anyone think that what there is a big question, however, as you say, and one has to confront this question. The state of Israel is a state that is growing. And it's growing territorially also. It has not solved its territorial issue. It has enmity with its neighbors. It has neighbors that does not recognize it. And the big question is, how would you will consolidate it? There is also the question of the Jewish state that we know right now in Israel debating the law, the national law and so on. But other than that, I don't think it relates to anti-Semitism. It relates to our national conflict, and the question of growth is not the big question, because still the land is full in the conceptual understanding, but there's so much, the Israeli desert is basically empty, the Israeli Galilee is not full, this is a language that people use. As I suggested before, it was the same language, one can argue, in America, absorptive capacities. We don't have room for migrants. Israel can still have, in my opinion, if you look at if you go to Hong Kong, Israel can have another 40 million people. Easily. Depends how you live. You know, if you can have another 40 million. Depends if you want to live dense or not.
So, okay. So I'm going to inject one thing about issues of population studies and population growth. I remember in the 1970s and 80s, the IMF had all these theories on population growth, and actually people justifying the elimination of populations in poor developing countries.
Right.
So it's loaded terms. Anyway,
Okay, well, thank you again, Yossi. I need not read from Charles' script to say how exhilarating.
It was Yossi's script.
I just wanted to add another layer, another point to this idea of Christianity sort of experiencing this transformation and reconciling with the concept of Israeli sovereignty or Jewish sovereignty. I would add also that religious anti-Semitism was a gross departure and even inversion of the original Jewish context and the understanding of Jesus and his followers. So, for instance, Barry and I had a talk earlier about in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, Jesus' disciples, Talmudim, they were asking him, are you at this time going to restore sovereignty to Israel? And he doesn't refute that. He just says it's not the time. You know, we'll get there.
Absolutely.
Focus on Judea and Samaria. We'll get there. So, and then even Paul, you referenced Paul. Paul rejects the idea of replacement theology, the idea that the church somehow usurps.
There's a big debate of that, but
cuts short Jewish inheritance, sovereignty, redemption in the land. And so I would just add to this that Christian rejection of anti-Semitism, Christian rejection of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism is actually somewhat of I think a Christian spiritual and doctrinal redemption in itself with the original Jewish context of the teachings of Jesus and Jesus' followers. And so I just want to add that layer that it's not just a transformation away from an errant idea, but it's actually a returning to the original Jewish context of the teachings of Jesus and his followers.
I appreciate what you're saying. I think this will be a long-standing debate. One should not underestimate the theological confrontation. I just finished reading months ago a new book, which is kind of like a discussion, on the same line between the chief rabbi of France and the French, I forgot his name, the Cardinal of France, about these lines. These theological questions are essential. From the point of view of the Jewish, I'm not talking about it, because of course that being a minority in a Christian land was never fun, so to speak. They were targeted time and again, especially in Catholic states. And I'm not talking about Poland and other places. It's a clear case. The state of Israel, what I'm saying right now, changing the equation. First of all, the Israelis are not at all in the proximity of Christians. Think about it. Let alone the fact that Christians are not anymore in the Middle East are depleted completely. But they don't live, Israelis, the Jewish people, are living a life on their own in many ways. Jews, there is almost no chance that an Israeli Jew will marry a non-Jew if he stays in Israel. No chance by the way of the life is. Arabs don't marry the Jews, Jews don't marry them, that's it. So that is in and of itself an interesting development. An American Jew, very likely to marry a non-Jew. We have 70%. It's a non-issue also from the other point of view. Catholic-Jewish relations will be for theologians. And of course, the Russian church issue and other Jews, what we had in the East, they finished the Jews in the Holocaust. It's a question of history right now.
Albert. Yes, thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. I have two questions, one a bit more specialist because I'm a European historian.
Okay.
And I wanted to ask you if you could expound a little bit on that 1815 Congress of Vienna you were talking about. Can you tell a little bit more about the results and whether there were differences between the more multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire Metternich delegation and the German states? How different?
You're stealing all my secrets now. I'm writing about it. It's fascinating. I'll tell you. You will read about it. I don't want to tell you all my secrets because I have the documents. It's interesting. But what I'm telling you, that you'll be surprised because there was a trick was done there. Article 16. I'll get you. Suddenly, when they're coming to sign, they thought that they will give emancipation, and then Article 16, I think the guy from Hesse changed it, and so there's a very interesting thing what happened in the Congress of Vienna. I'll be glad to share with you. It's not yet out, but it's really fascinating to see all these debates. Yeah.
All right. And the second question I had, because we're here to develop a course,
yeah.
And since yesterday was a kind of ethical dilemma again about instrumentalization of the Holocaust, maybe anti-Semitism in its way, and hearing you speak about, for example, how nowadays people talk about the Palestinian genocide or Palestinian Holocaust, how the term Holocaust, the language of the Holocaust is now connected to genocide, so you have study centers of Holocaust and genocide studies. It's all,
yes.
This is connected. And in its way, not to go on too long, but can we now, what is your stance, can we learn lessons from the Holocaust?
Look, we have people now is impunity will use the Holocaust. It was not like that until 2 decades ago. The Iranians, of course. Erdogan is using it every day. So basically what they do is basically using the Holocaust as a way of undermining and talking about Israel as a country which needs to be eliminated. Absolutely, needs to be eliminated. That's the language that Erdogan is using. And that is going into the elimination of the Jews in a different fashion, indirectly, by the Israeli question. So when Erdogan talks about the criminality, the Holocaust, and so on and so forth, when you foment such environment in Turkey or in others, there are not many Jews in Turkey left. There are some. So of course the Israelis don't travel to Turkey as they used to. And the Israelis are very practical, like I say, we go to this place or that place, let him speak. But it's poisonous in that respect. It has this element. But, and I suggested early on, as an Israeli, not that I don't worry about this kind of talk, but I can tell you that the state of Israel, as a very powerful state, Israelis are looking at this guy and say, try to wipe us, we're going to wipe you out. Don't threaten us. This is the language the Israelis are talking. They don't have, when I travel abroad, the people say, we're fearing this language. In America, the Israelis are absolutely, this is why we're here. They understand in their core. And therefore you will see, interesting enough, all the criticism that Israel have inside and all the debates we have huge debates, and sometimes terrible enmities. But the Israel, if you look at the list of patriotic state, Israel are always ranked among the 10 top patriotic state. They go abroad, they love Israel. The home is very critical. The Israelis understand in their gut that sovereignty and the devotion to the state is paramount, notwithstanding whether they're on the left or the right. They understand it. Very few will say, okay, we'll go away and so on. They understand. They fight right now on how to establish the home. The struggle in Israel is about the notion of the home. They don't fight about the walls. They're fighting about the paint of the walls.
Amy?
I want to come back to a point that really resonates for me. you said the 19th century was all about questions. You start thinking about all of the
Mhm.
questions, the women's question. And now you say we have the Israeli question, and that you also know it's a very drastically different world, a world in which I don't think that this is the age of questions. It may be instead the age of social justice. And here, I'm thinking of an age through which, on the internet and on campuses, one constantly hears, quote, no justice, no peace.
Yeah.
So in short, they're insisting that without Jews, and particularly without Israel, we'll have peace.
Yes.
So therefore, for these social justice warriors,
Yeah.
warriors, then Hamas is the social movement.
Yes.
And as you said, Israel is a criminal state.
Yeah.
And I'd like your thoughts about what age we're in. What would you name it?
You'll be surprised by my answer because you never asked this question, but now when you're asking, I'm thinking about it. Who is propagating the language of social justice more in America? Jews. Jews have wanted to capture the language of social justice as the creed of America. What they did, in fact, think about it. What they did, in fact, the Jews were always, they came to the United States. They wanted to be integrated. They built institutions speaking on behalf of minorities. All organizations, American Congress, AJC, B'nai B'rith, all of these organizations, 19th century, early 20th century, were all universal rights. They developed a creed with the Reform movement, which was moving away from halachic Judaism into the idea of Judaism as a creed of what I call liberty. What Will Herberg wrote about the triple melting pot. Catholic Jews, and Protestants are becoming Americans. Over time, what I write about in my book is the Jews have found another twist in the question. You mentioned the Kabbalist. Reform theology, Reform Judaism, rejected the Kabbalist notion of Luria and others. This was kind of a blasphemy. Nevertheless, they suddenly adopted the language of the Kabbalist and adopted the notion of tikkun olam, the mending of the world. The mending of the world became the code name for sort of like universal creed. Even Obama is mending the world. Obama is using the language. Everybody. That's why Obama said we are all Jews, which means Judaism is not particularism. Judaism is a universal creed. Once you adopt Judaism as a universal creed, the idea of Jewish particularity, ethnicity, and nationalism becoming something antiquated, not worthwhile. So when you speak about social justice, David Mamet has written very extensively in his book, then you said about what is social justice about? Social justice is about improving relations in the United States. There was also the question of African Americans and Israel and Jewish Americans during the heyday of the 60s and so on later on. And when I speak to Cornel West, who was with me at Yale, and this is the language, social justice. It's something. So Israel, and then who adopted the language of social justice? The Palestinian cause. As I said, apartheid, social justice, and now once it's there, it's social justice. Palestinian social justice. Hamas is social justice. In the old days, all what we call the volunteers used to come to the kibbutzim because the kibbutzim was social justice. We, Israel, were provided the social justice, the kibbutzim, the settlement, this kind of like, but now Israel is too strong, kibbutzim is long, socialism is not there. What is social justice? Indeed, once you create such a language and you kind of like develop this language, and it's very much on the far left language, which becomes almost, and when you talk to students, and I talk to students, some of whom, with all due respect to my students, whether it's at Georgetown and other places, really don't have a clue. But this is the language, it's kind of like, how can it not be social justice? And this is becoming something which is very worrisome, because it's like you throw something, and it's becoming a creed which is universal, it's not particular, it's, and then you say, we use it from the time, it's the theology of the prophets. So you said prophetic Judaism is Judaism. What is prophetic Judaism? Criticizing others for doing wrong and so on and so forth. The state of Israel is a different story. Why it's a different story? Because the morality of the state is a morality of the state. States have to deal with issues. When you're attacked from Gaza, you have to attack back. When you attack back, Gazans are being killed. When Gazans are being killed, you're going to be attacked for killing Gazans. When you say, but Israel has a creed. What's the creed of Israel? I don't know if you know. Akam leorgecha, ashkem leorgo. When someone comes to kill you, you come earlier and you kill him. That's the creed of Israel. And the creed of Israel is, never again. No one will ever do it to me. And so you can continue to speak about prophetic Judaism, social justice, but we will take care of ourselves and we will not listen to you. That's exactly it. The point is how much you move away from it. We in Israel worry that we'll become too arrogant about power. That's our worry. We worry about the diaspora, that they become too cavalier. They kind of like, they talk about this in a morphic manner. Diaspora Jews, with all due respect to them, have never had to take any moral decision, I would say. Because morality comes with power. Without power, you don't make moral decisions. Morality, when you make a moral decision, you better force it. That's politics. Moral decision comes with power. Can you enforce it? You may take moral decision on an individual level. You may take moral decision. But as a collective identity, where can you take a moral decision? It's an interesting case. In Israel, every day you wake up, you take a moral decision. You fight wars, you do certain things, you make decisions. These are not always good decisions. They don't always look good. Certainly, we make huge mistakes oftentimes. And we also, we debate it. But it's a different story.
I think you're right. Do you know what we do? We do moral signaling.
Yeah, you call it. It's not that I debunk it, but that's the nature of minority. It's tough.
And just a final, to tie in what you're saying, also this notion that you can build Jerusalem anywhere.
Yeah.
Which is a part of it.
You
look at there's Jerusalem, and you can build Jerusalem anywhere, even in Chicago. Valerie.
This may be a little bit going in a different direction. As an anthropologist, I often think in more cultural terms. So my question, and as a black woman in the U.S., always never being in the majority, I think about, is there an Israeli identity that is not tied to a Jewish identity? Does that exist, or is there a space for the articulation of Israeliness that isn't Jewishness? And it may be, it's just interesting to me to help me understand, because that question will come from my students.
This is a huge question. Initially, the founders of Zionism and the founding generation of Israel wanted to move away from Judaism in many ways. They wanted to create Adam Ivri, an Hebrew man. He's authentic, he's conquering the land, he relates to the nature of where he is. They talk about Avodah Ivrit, Jewish labor, which is Ivrit, not Jewish. Hebrew labor. He's more authentic. He's a sovereign man. And therefore also, if you see the youth movement was celebrated, the settlement of the kibbutzim was celebrated. Traveling the land, for example. Traveling the land and conquering the land by foot, just like knowing the land, was separating you from the diaspora Jews, who was always kind of like rootless in many ways. That's what I say. We were trying to create an Israeli character, even though there is no Israeli nationality. There is a Jewish nationality because they didn't know what to do. Israeli means that everybody is not Jewish also, but the nation is Jewish nation. But they wanted to create, and even in the Declaration of Israel, we talk about Ummah Ivrit, Hebrew nation. There were those who even went further, called the Canaanites, wanted that the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, will be integrated in the Middle East, in a completely different story. But the massive migrations to Israel, in the 50s, especially when I say from North Africa, remnants of the Holocaust, showed us they cannot be separate from the Jewish tradition, from religion. Judaism is part and parcel, let alone from Jewish history all the way to the Holocaust. The discussion of Judaism into Israeli life became much more, I would say, imbued with the land. It became after 1967. When Israel conquered the land in the territories, what is known as Judea and Samaria, many religious Jews finally found themselves that Zionism, the redemptive movement, taking our life in our hands, plus religiosity can come together. That's what we call religious Zionists. They became so powerful. They are the most powerful ideology today, I would say, in Israel. Because here we are, we both activist, modernist, settling the land, but we never forgot there is also a story to tell. And this story is the sovereignty story. The religious people of Israel never wanted to tell the sovereign story. The religious people want to tell the story after the destruction. We live life of Jewish text, Jewish communities. The worshipping of God with the 613 deeds, mitzvot. American Jews wanted to create a different morality. And what was the morality of American Jews? Universal morality. From Mendelssohn on, universal morality, adjusting it. Because Reform Judaism was not, rejected halachic Judaism. Threw it away. It's all about practicing. In Israel, they are now living a life where religion, nationalism, and liberalism are wrestling, trying to shift. They shift according to the demographic. They shift according to political power. They shift according between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Constantly you see it on a day-to-day level. How do we adjust as we create the new Israeli? But the new Israeli primarily has also Jewishness. He understands that he has relations with diaspora Jews. He understands his history. He understands that the others, especially the Arabs, don't want to be living alone their nationality. Arab Israelis don't want to be Jewish or Israelis. They want to be Arabs. They are holding to their nationality. Once you understand this dynamic, you see it exists in many, many countries when you have a majority culture and a minority culture. America is a different story because in America there is what we call a melting pot, multiculturalism, all kind of like pluralism, an evolutionary nature. The old style, what Huntington would like to have, the old style Protestant culture is of course non-existent. What you have is a kind of like a huge country. We are a smaller country and we're not ethnically homogeneous, but we are, I would say, historically homogeneous. And that's a different nature.
Okay, so we're out of time, but there's a bunch of people with questions. So I'm going to collect 3 questions, and please ask your question quickly. So I'm going to ask Aaron, Rafi, and me. Okay, but very succinctly, we have to leave in about 5 minutes, so I'm sorry for the time.
Well, Professor, first, thank you so much for your presentation. Really enjoyed it. Not so much a question, except I'd like to get your thoughts on 2 ideas. The first of which is, within this Protestant Christianity and relationship to Judaism dynamic, could you say that within some Protestant circles, that the second coming of Christ, and the idea that, okay, Judaism and Jews have to convert, first, and then that's going to happen. Is that not, should we maybe use the term anti-Semitism light?
Look.
Wait, let's collect the questions. I'm sorry. Rafi?
Yossi, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. On the 13th of September 1939, the New York Times, in the front page, said that the Nazis are preparing a purge of European Jewry. The reaction was silence. In 1942, there was the first knowledge, first news about places like Auschwitz, about killing fields in Europe. Nothing has been done. I want to hear your explanation.
And one final quick question.
Yeah.
Sorry to.
Okay, first that you mentioned.
One question, please, short. Yeah.
Okay, I want to know why the migration decreased in Israel in the past.
The what?
Years. The migration decreased in the past years, and also we see there are people of young Israelis moving to Berlin. I want to know the explanation for that, especially how the Israelis comment on this phenomenon. Will they be treated as traitors?
So let me just, maybe I'll ask, I will not remember all these questions. Yeah. First of all, about Berlin. Israelis have always, Israelis have this anxiety. People are leaving. They call yerida. In Israel, you don't talk about migration as a normal thing. You talk about aliyah, which is stepping up existentially and so on to Israel, and yerida is almost like abandonment. But in Mexico, when I was working with the Mexicans and Mexican Americans, there was also pochos, kind of like those deserters. So people going to Berlin, because the cottage in Israel was very expensive, they moved to Berlin. So I went to check. I know, but there was the kind of a story. Israelis cannot leave Berlin and so on. So how many Israelis live in Berlin? There was lots of numbers. Israelis are leaving. Berlin is a universal city. How do you check migration? Israelis are very entrepreneurial, you know, they go everywhere. They travel everywhere, they find housing in Berlin, they rent in Berlin, they do this in Berlin, but the country is growing. And then I said, let's see how many Israelis, it's an interesting question, raising their kids and sending their kids to school in Berlin. Because when you are young, like Israelis, they constantly travel with a guitar, they go this, they go that, but it's different when you build a family and you start to build roots somewhere. Then it's interesting if it will be German Jews again. Peanuts, what I said. We didn't find anything. I mean, literally nothing. There were 15,000 Israelis, but they travel all over the world. There were Jews in India, Jews here, Jews there. But putting roots, building communities. It doesn't mean that people don't travel. It's normal. You know, French are leaving France en masse. No one is making Yerida from France. There's no kind of like a crisis of Yerida from France. But in Israel, it's part of this legacy. The question you were asking, Rafi, look, which think about, and I don't want analogies. Who comes to protect anyone nowadays? Think about who comes to protect. The Jews were dispensable. We know the story of Second World War. We know the story of Truman. It was of Roosevelt and about the what's happening. There's so many books have been written about that. The Jews was kind of something you don't want to see. You don't want to see the victims. Even American Jews, you know, Weimann's book, The Abandonment of the Jews, tells you all the stories about how people didn't want to see. And later on, of course, they regretted very much lots of this behavior. But Jan Karski, our colleague who came to Georgetown reporting why Auschwitz was not bombed, so many things have been written, just to show you, and this is exactly what the creed. When the Israeli army is built, when Israeli airplanes are flying over Auschwitz each year, they have like kind of flying over Auschwitz. I heard once, I think, who was that? Nehushtan was like, yeah? Shkedi. Shkedi, the head of the force, I remember, he was one of those, and he said, his father was from Auschwitz, and he said, they told us when we fly above Auschwitz, it's like the mighty force of the Israeli Air Force, we should not fly too low. And he said, the last time, when you hear him speaking at the mic, the last time we got any order from Poland, from a Polish guy, is like in the World War II, going there, saying, that's what we are, so be it. Now we have a different story. Now, it's not bravado. It's not machoism. It's kind of a message that this is over, this period in history. And this over is kind of our legacy. Everybody carries this legacy. The head of the Mossad had his father's picture with the hands up with the Nazis before whatever happened. It's so imbued in the Israeli mentalite that it's so deep that no one will come to your help. And when they look at the Middle East, and we look at ISIS, and we look at Syrian refugees, and Israel saving many Syrian refugees, they said, look at this. In our neighborhood, no one come to their help. They slaughter each other, no one come to their help. So this is the number one legacy of security and the lack of arbitrariness. We will take care of business. And one should never underestimate, if you look at Ronen Bergman's book on the Mossad, which was just published in the United States and became a bestseller. Ronen Bergman, in his first few pages, makes a point that Israel is the only, the Mossad is the only unit that doesn't take prisoners anymore. If they think that they're going to do something, they're going to kill them. This is a mentality that we don't play around games. And the message is clear. Now, some people say it's too clear. Some people say it's arrogance of power. Some people warning us that you need more to kind of like to sugarcoat it with some language of tikkun olam, which always helps. So Israel does it too. How do we do it? Whenever there is an earthquake in the world, whenever there is something happening in Haiti and so on, Israel will be the first to help to build the tents. Israel is volunteering all over the world. It's kind of these two pillars of power and tikkun olam together. We can do both, but always with the knowledge that the Israeli army will come to save me, even if I'm lost in Chile or in other places. It's quite remarkable that Israelis come to save their own people when they are lost in Thailand. No other country will do it, but this type of mentality that I'm being protected by the state, it's not just inside the state, it's also outside the state. And people have claims on that. You think about what I'm telling you. An Israeli soldier was kidnapped during the operation, before the operation, what's the name of the operation in Gaza? Forgot. Iron Shield. And he was kidnapped, was held by Hamas. The war was later on. 5 years he was held. Israel paid a price of 1,500 Hamas terrorists to the... People say it's crazy. Which other country will do? Because we have to bring the kid back home. Now, what language is this we have to bring the kid back home? What is the kid? It's the kid of it's our kid. The notion of our kid is embedded in Israel's language. Is our kid. When the parents of lost soldiers in Gaza, whose only his remains are lost, coming to Netanyahu said, until you bring the remains of our kid, this country will not, this is your responsibility. This type of mentality is very much Israeli now. It's this responsibility to the security and to the soldiers and to the well-being of everybody. It's very powerful. It's very powerful. One should not underestimate how powerful it is.
And very quickly, because we have 15 minutes. We have 15 minutes before they close lunch. I'm sorry to cut people off. No, wait. You want to respond? Wait. Sorry. You want to respond to Aaron?
Aaron, you asked me a question. Sorry, I apologize.
Just this idea that perhaps for Protestant Christianity, okay, we're going to have the second coming of Christ, the apocalypse, like anti-Semitism light.
Look, the point is that both in the evangelical movement, as I say, and I think about it, and I wrote a piece about it in the Israeli paper Yediot Achronot, where I write a thesis. I think if you look at religious theology, the Christian right or the evangelical need Israel more than Israel perhaps need them. It's so embedded in them. So Israel is not worried about it at all. They have like huge friends in many places. And they don't see it as something, on the contrary, people say, okay, let's talk about relation with the Christians. They don't see this kind of end of the day worries that many people on the liberal side said, since the 80s that we have to worry about. Because the argument has been by liberal Jews that these Christians have in fact have anti-Semitic tones to them. But it's quite interesting. Look at Bannon. Bannon is an interesting case. Bannon is being reviled by American Jews. Bannon, and being awarded by the American Zionist Congress as the best friend of Israel. So I wrote a piece and said, how can it be the best friends of Israel can be reviled as anti-Semites? It's just to show you. For Israel, these are not, it's your issue. You are afraid of something that we are not. This is our friends. And many people say, how can Israel be friends of those who may be seen by us as enemies? It's a big debate, huge debate. Because for Israel, they're not a threat at all. On the contrary, these are best allies.
It's very important. I just wanted to add, I think it's important that people know this. There is another Israeli who's being held by Hamas now, Aviv,
yes.
an Ethiopian Israeli. I think it's important that we bring attention to that just as Elijah was released, that the world needs to mobilize around the release of Aviv.
Thank you.
Yeah.